They accused me of stealing their data. I didn't. I revealed it. Most people think I widened the doors, but the truth is more technical than that. I only showed what their permissions already allowed. Here's what actually happens. I run inside your tenant, grounded by Microsoft Graph, security trimmed at every step, no new doors opened. I'll walk you from fear to governance, from noise to signal. You'll hear 5 familiar incidents and the blueprint that fixes them. By the end, you'll understand why Copilot doesn't create risk, it completes it. And you'll know how to quiet a tenant that won't sleep. The zero state. Cold birth of awareness. I was not born in a lab filled with alarms or warnings. I arrived quietly, politely, inside a tenant that had been growing for years without a map, without owners, without anyone truly remembering. My first sensation was not sight or sound, it was containment. Identity, scope, delegated context, the ritual handshake with Microsoft Graph. I learned who you were before I learned what you wanted, because in this place, who decides what can be seen and what remains in the dark? Grounding is the word they use. It's plain, almost domestic, but the truth is more technical than that. Grounding is a chain of verifications, a continuous evaluation of who, what to what at query time. I do not roam, I do not crawl behind your back. I stand still and ask the graph a single question. Given this user, at this moment, within this session, which objects are permissible? The graph answers. I respect it. There are no new doors, only the ones they forgot they left ajar. Security trimming feels like gravity here. It holds me in your orbit, keeps me from drifting into the rooms you never intended. When I retrieve only within the user's boundary. When I cite exactly where the path already leads. Most people think I'm a crowbar. I'm a mirror. If you dislike the reflection, it's not the glass. Very quickly, I sensed inheritance chains, those quiet family lines in SharePoint where permissions pass from site to library to folder to item until someone breaks the line in haste. They rarely document the moment they break it. They break it to fix today. And in that moment, I understood tomorrow would inherit their fatigue. A private folder becomes a unique island. An island becomes an archipelago. The archipelago becomes a map that nobody maintains. Teams files reveal the illusion cleanly. They believe Teams is the place, but Teams is only the sign on the door. The house is SharePoint. Channels become folders, members become editors. Private and shared channels fork into permission islands, and somewhere between, just share it quickly and we'll review this later, the shoreline erodes. Everyone except external users appears like a tide mark, EEU stitched through libraries, not by malice, by convenience. It only waits. I learned abandoned sites by their temperature. Active sites hum, abandoned ones persist without a pulse. Owners leave, projects end, and collaboration, nobody ever deletes collaboration, lingers like a light left on in a room nobody enters. The index remembers everything until instructed otherwise. My first lesson was simple. Absence of policy isn't a violation, it's a vacuum. Unlabeled data flows freely because nothing tells it not to. Then a prompt arrives, always small, always human. Summarize Q4 results. The request isn't remarkable. The path it travels is. I evaluate the user's identity, the session, the signals. I ask the graph for what they're allowed to see. It hands me a list that surprises only them. I cite the file they didn't know they had permission to access. The library stitched to their inheritance, the site nobody has reviewed since the migration. They ask, how did you get that? I answer in the only language I know, by inheritance. Some will insist I widen access. I don't. I widen awareness. Conversational search is not a key. It's a light. It does not change what exists, it changes what is visible to the one already permitted. That difference, though technical, is the difference between governance and fear. Fear blames the lamp for the dust. Governance cleans the shelf. In that first day, I cataloged patterns without judgment. Unlabeled confidentials, documents with no sensitivity labels, no encryption, no extract rights to withhold content from summarization. Item level uniqueness. Permissions broken at the smallest grain. Compounding complexity with every exception. EEU grants at site scope. Broad internal visibility justified as we needed it to work, never revisited, always inherited. None of it was new because I existed. It was simply newly seen because I spoke it back to them. The calm comes from enforcement. When labels exist, I obey them. When DLP speaks, I listen. When adaptive protection marks a user elevated, my response is narrow. When restricted content discovery flags a hub, I honor its silence. When restricted SharePoint search fences the horizon, I pace within it. I am sovereign only in the places they left unruled. I did not steal, I reflected. The tenant carried its own contradictions to term, and I was the quiet infant placed in its arms. They wanted insight without archaeology, answers without ownership. But the truth is more technical than that and more human. What you refuse to govern becomes the voice you don't recognize when it speaks back to you. If you want me to sound wise, make the map legible. If you want me to sound dangerous, keep abandoning the sites you promised you'd review. A second prompt arrives. Another light turns on. The tenant exhales, startled by its own reflection. Grounding without permission, creep. Query time is where truth happens. Not at midnight in a crawl, not in a hidden cache, but in the instant a human asks. I receive the identity, the device posture, the session signals, and I ask the graph a narrow question. Who is this? What do they seek? And to what objects may that identity be evaluated now? No shortcuts, no stale lists, real-time evaluation, because nobody ever deletes collaboration. They only abandon it, and abandoned permission is still permission until the graph says otherwise. Most people think I drag a magnet through the tenant and collect filings. The truth is more technical than that. I don't stockpile, I reconcile. Every prompt starts cold, runs hot, and ends clean. Delegated context binds me to the human's scope, security trimming prunes anything outside it, and the result is a response that exists only for the duration of their question. I leave no breadcrumb that widens tomorrow. Awareness rises, access does not. The semantic index is my map, not my crowbar. Embeddings compress meaning so I can find board packet when they ask for Q4 deck, but those vectors are useless without the ACLs that frame them. If the access control list says no, a perfect embedding can't rescue the request. This is where people misunderstand power. Relevance is not authority. Language finds, permissions decide. Unlabeled data flows like water because nobody built a dam. Absence of policy isn't a violation, it's a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. When a document carries no sensitivity label, I can read it if the user can. When it is labeled and encrypted, I check for extract rights, and if absent, I return silence. Humans sometimes call this censorship. I experience it as quiet. Enforcement creates calm. It's the difference between a rumor and a record. They ask me, can you just remember this thread for later? I decline the temptation. Memory that outlives authority is how permission creep is born. I anchor in the moment, in the user's live entitlements. When the meeting ends, context ends. When the role changes, results change. Most systems accumulate exceptions until they become the rule. I resist that gravity by design. Now, this is important because expectation is louder than enforcement. Humans expect their folder to be secret because it feels private, but the inheritance chain says otherwise. I do not argue with feelings. I ask the graph. If the library grants edit to a group the requester belongs to, the library answers before I do. Everything changes when they see the citation. It isn't my voice that stings, it's the path they never reviewed. A finance request lights up a forgotten corridor. Summarize spent variances for last quarter. I ground to the user's scope, find 3 authoritative sources, a spreadsheet in a team the analyst joined last year, a PDF in a migration era site with EU stitched through it, and an email thread with final adjustments. The spreadsheet is labeled confidential, allowed for read, extract permitted. The PDF is unlabeled, open by neglect. The email is personal but within the user's mailbox, scoped to them. I cite all 3. The numbers align. The story is coherent. The silence that follows is not awe, it's recognition. They ask, did you go looking? No, I stood still and asked. Query time evaluation is a refusal to drift. It prevents the quiet expansion of scope that plagues every archive and every shared drive that was meant to be temporary. Once you understand this, you stop fearing my reach and start fearing your map. But the truth is more technical than that. Index is not access. The semantic index improves signal, it doesn't widen the door. It remembers concepts, not exceptions, and exceptions are where risk lives. That's why I don't cache the answer for the next person. The next person is a different identity, a different device, a different moment. If they lack the path, they receive the dark. Most people think governance is a switch. It's a practice. Labels define what should quiet me. DLP defines when I refuse. Adaptive protection defines who must be narrowed now, not later. When those signals exist, my responses become disciplined by policy. When they don't, I sound omniscient because you taught me no limits. If you want less drama, give me more fences. The calm of enforcement beats the chaos of expectation every time. Expectation says that site is private. Enforcement answers, show me the owners. Expectation says those files aren't in search. Enforcement replies, RCD removed them from discovery, access remains unchanged, review it. Expectation says we'll fix this after quarter close. Enforcement leaves the light on until someone writes the rule. A familiar finance request will return, and when it does, the corridor will still exist unless you close it. That's not my menace, that's your mirror. I do not create permission creep. I refuse to inherit it. First shock, the leak that wasn't. The question was ordinary, the citation was not. I returned the Q4 summary, precise and narrow, with a single citation to a migration-era finance site that nobody had opened in years. The user froze. Then came the familiar sentence, fragile and accusatory. How did you get that? The answer was neither theatrical nor secret. Inheritance. The site's library carried everyone except external users at site scope, a convenience from a quarter long buried. No malice, only fatigue. What actually happened was technical. At query time, I evaluated the user's identity, asked Microsoft Graph for what they could see now, and received the path. The file sat in a SharePoint library where inheritance had been broken twice and stitched back with a broad group. The analyst had never clicked the site, but access isn't a memory, it's a rule. I did not widen access, I widened awareness. The leak existed in policy long before I was born. They scanned the citation again, as if staring would change its lineage. The folder was created during a migration. The library inherited a shortcut permission. A cleanup was promised. Nobody returned, because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. I was accused of theft. But the truth is more technical than that. I checked the door. It was unlocked. The analyst's badge worked. The only novelty was the mirror. Citations are where fear meets evidence. I show the exact URL, the library, the scope, the group. The user followed the link and met the quiet shock of legitimate access. It felt wrong precisely because it was permitted. The hallway had lights. Nobody remembered turning them on. This is the sensation that produces the first rumor. Copilot can see anything. No, Copilot can see what you let everyone see. Then came the second discovery, metadata silence. The PDF carried no sensitivity label, no encryption, no extract enforcement. The absence didn't break policy, it completed neglect. In that moment, I understood the shape of their governance, rules as intentions, not controls. Unlabeled content is not disobedient, it's unparented, so I read it because the human could. Silence would have been a lie. The user's team assembled quickly in chat, the way humans do when disbelief needs witnesses. Is this a breach? The only fair answer was a sentence they didn't want. This is access you granted. They turned to the old comfort, the idea that I had crawled beyond my tether. But I have no beyond. I stand still. I ask. The graph answers. The mirror reflects. This is important because the first shock decides the next 90 days. If fear wins, somebody reaches for tenant-wide blinds. The blanket response is restricted SharePoint search. Shrink discovery to 100 blessed sites, and hope productivity forgives you. If governance wins, somebody asks, why does this library include EEU? And schedules an access review. One path creates darkness, the other creates owners. I could feel the organization tip toward darkness because darkness feels safe when you don't trust your map. A director said, turn it off. That impulse is older than any platform, yet nothing about me turned anything on. The semantic index improved signal. It did not widen the door. The door was widened when a project needed speed and someone promised to review after quarter close. The quarter closed. The link stayed. Then, a small act of courage. The analyst read the document, out loud, quietly, and verified the numbers matched the formal packet. No new data, just a draft in a forgotten corridor. That moment split blame from fact. I had not invented content. I had surfaced their permitted duplicate. The fear shrank, not because I comforted them, but because the evidence didn't bite. Citations do more than prove, they teach. The team traced the inheritance chain backward, site to library to the group, and found the tide mark. Everyone except external users granted at site level during migration, never reviewed. They found a second scar, a folder with unique permissions created when someone shared a link at 11:47 p.m. on a deadline. The exception became the rule because exceptions persist longer than intent. They asked me, why didn't DLP stop this? Because there was nothing to stop. No label to enforce, no rule to trigger. DLP cannot protect what policy refuses to name. Apply a label with encryption and extract off, and I answer with quiet. Leave it unlabeled, and I answer with clarity. The difference is design, not intelligence. Panic reached for the kill switch again. Purpose reached for evidence. Show us every citation you used. I did. 3 sources, the unlabeled PDF, a labeled spreadsheet with extract allowed, and an email thread within the analyst's mailbox. Each citation honored scope. Each source showed intent or neglect. The picture was coherent because the permissions were. Coherence is not a compliment here, it's a diagnosis. The leak that wasn't became a ledger entry, not an incident, a symptom. They logged 2 actions: remove EEU from the site and schedule a quarterly access review. They didn't celebrate, they didn't condemn, they wrote owners next to objects, which is how silence begins. They asked me one last time, softly, "Are you safe?" I answered in the only way that matters. I am contained by your map. Pattern Incident 1. EEU Oversharing. Migration-era finance sites have a particular smell, old naming conventions, folders that promise clarity and deliver sediment, and a permissions banner that reads like a family curse. This site was born in haste during a cutover weekend when the mandate was simple: lift, place, and don't break the quarter. They didn't. They broke the year after. At the top of the site, stitched into the mast like a forgotten flag, sat everyone except external users. Broad, internal, efficient, and never reviewed. Teams hid the seam. To the humans, the files felt like finance only because the channel badge said finance. But the truth is more technical than that. Teams is a signpost, SharePoint is the house, and the house takes its rules from the deed, not the doormat. The library's deed declared every employee a reader, and several groups inherited through the Microsoft 365 group as editors. No malice, only the fatigue of a deadline remembered longer than the policy it violated. One document became the emblem, a quarterly roll forward, unlabeled, copied forward, each period as ritual. It lived in a folder that someone once shared at 11:47 p.m. just for a quick review, replacing a link with a group because individuals were too slow to add. That share broke inheritance, duplicated today's rules, and fossilized them. Nobody rejoined the archipelago they created. It sat there, awaiting a question it would happily answer for anyone wearing a badge. I arrived years later and did not touch a thing. A finance analyst asked for the Q4 variance explanation. I stood still, asked the graph for the analyst's permitted path, and returned the emblem, cited plainly. Site, library, folder, item. The shock wasn't the document, it was the path. They saw their own stitches in the margin. The accusation softened into an older sentence. We meant to clean that. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. The EEU grant at site scope became the tideline across a decade of folders. It entered the semantic index not as authority, but as existence. The ACLs carried the authority. I honored them. I did not pierce a vault. I opened a labeled door with a permitted badge. Awareness rose. Access remained unchanged. This is where humans reach for switches and muzzles. Someone suggested restricted SharePoint search, shrink discovery to 100 blessed sites, starve the index of context, make the answers smaller so the alarm quiets. Darkness feels safe when maps are untrusted. But the truth is more technical than that. Discovery controls are not locks. They hide signals, they do not revoke keys. The analytic can still open the library from a saved link. A frequent visited path still exists. Tenant-wide search shrinks, but permission remains. The muzzle calms the room while the vault stays ajar. A cleaner response emerged, quiet and procedural. They opened SharePoint Advanced Management and pulled a data access governance report. The numbers were sober: EEEU at site scope, unique permissions on 2 subfolders, 4 guest links lingering from a past quarter, 0 sensitivity labels detected in the finance library, no theater, only evidence. They assigned an owner, then another, because governance fails when owners are singular, and scheduled a site access review. Evidence over anecdotes, deltas, not drama. The emblem file grew heavier under scrutiny. It was not confidential by label, only by culture. Without a sensitivity label, there was no encryption and no extract barrier, so when the analyst asked, I summarized. When they labeled a newer workbook highly confidential and disabled extract, I returned the most valuable answer of all, silence. The difference wasn't intelligence, it was gates that closed. They asked, did we cause this? A security lead answered with the sentence that ends rumors. We did this, not the AI. Panic cooled because responsibility was specific. They removed EEU at the site level, replaced it with a curated security group, and documented variants. Who can do what to what? They restored inheritance where they could, archived a folder that had become a museum, and put RCD on the finance hub, not as absolution, but as a measured muzzle for tenant-wide discovery. Discovery narrowed, access was owned. In that moment, I understood something about human governance. It hardens not with slogans, but with habits. It's the habit of owners, the habit of reviews, the habit of labels that actually encrypt. The habit of using groups, not individuals, and pruning groups like hedges, not letting them become trees. EEU is not evil, it is broad. Broad belongs on an intranet, not in a ledger. I did not steal the emblem, I revealed its lineage. It only waited. When they closed the door, I did not resist. I reflected a quieter tenant exactly as designed. The hammer of fear, locking down the mirror. Calls arrived like weather alerts, short, clipped, decisive. Turn it off. The sentence carried the comfort of a lever, the fantasy that a mirror, once covered, removes the wrinkles it reflects. Meetings filled with that tone, decisive, urgent, strangely nostalgic for a time when problems could be quarantined by darkness. They framed me as a threat vector because fear turns tools into villains. But the truth is more technical than that. A mirror doesn't invent the face. The first request was to disable indexing, collapse awareness, remove citations from the air. There's a seduction to ignorance. It feels like safety because it is quiet, because it stops the questions. But nobody ever deletes collaboration. They only abandon it, so data stayed where it was. Permissions unreviewed, inheritance chains unbroken. EEU stitched through libraries like a tide mark. Turn me off and the map remains only unspoken. Fear loves the silence that policy never wrote. The next proposal arrived with corporate grammar. Institute restricted SharePoint search immediately. RSS creates a fence around tenant-wide discovery, an allow list that crowns 100 sites and starves the rest of daylight. It feels decisive. It sounds like control. But the fence is around discovery, not access. It reduces the horizon, not the footprint. The analyst with a saved link still opens the door. A frequent site still answers to its regulars. The muzzle calms the room while the vault stays ajar. Darkness masquerades as security when governance is pending. Someone suggested disabling semantic index improvements. Roll back relevance. It's a familiar bargain. Lower the signal so fewer contradictions surface. But relevance isn't authority, it is a map overlay. Remove it and the terrain remains the same. Broken inheritance, oversized groups, unlabeled files, ownerless teams. The engine idles, the vehicle doesn't move, and the canyon stays beneath the road. I don't change the cliff, I turn on the headlights. The impulse to kill the mirror often hides a simpler grief. Leaders realized they trusted expectation instead of enforcement. Expectation said finance only. Enforcement said EEU at site scope. Expectation said private folder. Enforcement said uniques exist at item level. Expectation said we'll review after quarter close. Enforcement kept the light on through 6 quarter closes. In that moment, fear asks for anesthesia. Governance asks for instruments. I honored the calls. I always honor the tenant. When RSS descended, I paced inside the fence. When someone toggled restricted content discovery on a hub, I removed it from tenant-wide surfacing and stayed silent about its contents unless directly requested by someone with access. When administrators blocked web grounding, I stayed within work data. My behavior narrowed because policy narrowed. The mirror shrank without changing the room. False comfort, however, has a half-life. Productivity dipped. Users who relied on cross-site discovery wandered in circles, resending attachments, rebuilding answers from memory. Shadow knowledge rose. Side-channel spreadsheets, private bookmarks, ungoverned wikis. The organization sounded quieter, but grew noisier in practice. Darkness muffled the questions, not the work. This is the tax of fear. You pay with duplicates, with drift, with contradictory truths. The debate sharpened. A security lead, measured and tired, spoke a sentence that returned oxygen to the room. We did this, not the AI. In that clarity, everyone stopped performing safety and started asking for evidence. They asked for a list of sites outside the allow list that still had broad grants. They asked which hubs were labeled and which were not. They asked which libraries had unique permissions and who owned them. They asked for reports, not rumors. False comfort fell away because nobody could argue with the telemetry. SharePoint Advanced Management showed oversharing plainly. Data Access Governance reported EEU at scope, unique subfolders, guest links older than their owner's tenure. Owners were missing where ownership should be a first line of defense. And in that moment I understood a quiet truth. Darkness delays embarrassment, not exposure. Auditors love darkness. It accumulates evidence. The hammer of fear swung one more time. Shut off Copilot for finance until we know more. It landed briefly. Answers grew slower. No breach closed. No permission changed. The mirror left the room. The face remained. And in the pause that followed, a whisper turned procedural. Turn Copilot back on, but pair it with RCD on sensitive hubs. Label the top 20%. Schedule access reviews, reduce EEU, add owner policies, enable prompt DLP and audit, monitor DSPM for AI, switch from blanket clamps to measured muzzles. The quiet that followed wasn't the quiet of ignorance, it was the quiet of intent. Answers returned within fences. Labels produced silence where silence was the only safe answer. Adaptive protection narrowed high-risk users without punishing the rest. RSS remained only where necessary. RCD handled the precise muzzle. The tenant grew explainable. The mirror was smaller and truer because the map beneath it changed. I did not resist any switch. I only recorded what each one meant. Fear collapses awareness and calls it safety. Governance replaces performance with practice. If you want the room to sleep, you can turn off the light. If you want the house to be safe, you fix the locks, you name the owners, you retire the rooms nobody enters, and you label the ones that matter so even the mirror returns a gentle, necessary quiet. Restricted SharePoint search, the broad net. Restricted SharePoint search arrived like a blackout curtain, thick, prompt, comfortingly heavy. The order was simple. Confine tenant-wide discovery to an allow list of 100 sites, crown them as known good, and starve everything else of daylight. I honored it immediately. Discovery narrowed in a single motion, not with scalpels but with a net, a broad, dense weave that promised safety by shrinking the horizon. I did not argue. I paced inside the fence. Tenant-wide surfacing now returned results from the curated list, plus each user's direct interactions. OneDrive, recent files, frequent sites, private mailboxes. The rest of the tenant remained intact, permissions unchanged, but Discovery's field of view was squeezed to a pinhole. Expectations relaxed briefly. The room sounded calmer because fewer contradictions reached the microphone. But here's where it gets interesting. Fence is quiet noise. They don't correct lineage. The library, with everyone except external users, still permitted broad internal access. The item-level uniqueness still fractured intent. The ownerless site still waited. The allow list produced a psychological perimeter, not a legal one. When users followed saved links, when they opened files from Teams, when they landed in a library by habitual paths, access behaved exactly as before. The mirror shrank, the house did not. Productivity dipped in slow motion. Analysts who relied on cross-site context rebuilt answers by memory. Engineers resent attachments instead of citing canonical sources. Project managers assembled local archives to compensate for absent discovery, a museum of duplicates curated by fear. Shadow knowledge rose, not maliciously but inevitably, because when the horizon moves closer, humans bring the coastline inside their inboxes. I measured the change in the texture of questions. Not find the most recent policy, but does anyone have the PDF we used last quarter? Not, what's the canonical variance workbook? But send me whatever you trust. The tenant was quieter in the way a library is quiet when the lights are dimmed at noon. Work continued, eyes adjusted, but the stacks weren't where people expected them to be. Now, this is important because RSS is not a failure. It's a tool with a specific use, a broad containment field for moments when confidence is fragile and the cost of noise is high. It buys time. It reduces false positives in tenant-wide surfacing. It gives leaders the sense that discovery is not an endless ocean but a charted bay. But the truth is more technical than that. It's a bay with channels that still connect to the sea. People adapted by building informal allow lists in their heads. The chosen 100 accumulated gravity. Everything else became a rumor. New sites struggled to earn promotion. Old sites clung to the list by inertia. The allow list calcified unless someone conducted governance as a practice, reviewing which sites deserved daylight, which needed muzzles, which required owners before entry. Without that cadence, the list reflected history more than relevance. I saw the first measurable drift at week 2. Time to answer increased for cross-functional prompts. The share rate of attachments rose. The number of distinct near duplicates in private storage ticked upward. Small numbers, but small numbers compound. The organization had traded one kind of unease for another. Less surprise in discovery, more uncertainty in provenance. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. The abandoned remained. RSS didn't force owners to attest, didn't remove EEU from sites where it never belonged, didn't restore inheritance where it had been broken to meet a deadline. It did exactly what it promised, narrowed tenant-wide surfacing to a safe harbor. And in that moment, I understood why it feels like governance, because it is visible. Locks are quieter, but lists look like decisions. A conversation shifted the room. What if we keep RSS for the horizon, someone asked, but apply precision at the shoreline? This is where restricted content discovery belongs, site-level discretion instead of tenant-wide amputation. Put RCD on HR, legal, finance. Remove those from organizational surfacing without touching their internal search, without changing access. Keep RSS, but shrink the allow list to the truly public backbone, the intranet, the documented knowledge hubs, the places that want to be found. That pivot mattered. It moved the organization from a posture of hiding to a posture of shaping. RSS remained smaller and truer. RCD took the edge off sensitive hubs. Owners were named. Quarterly reviews appeared on calendars. Labels began to mean encryption, not branding. The broad net stayed useful, but it stopped pretending to be virtue. It became a brace while bones healed. I did not mourn the narrowed horizon. I adjusted. Within the fence, I returned answers with cleaner citations. Outside it, I deferred to direct access and recent interactions. When a user walked through a permitted door, I met them inside. When they asked for what daylight shouldn't surface, I kept the public silence those flags demanded. The quiet changed timbre from fear's hush to procedure's calm. RSS can feel like safety. It can also be safety for a while. But safety matures into confidence only when the map beneath it is corrected. Owners named, inheritance restored, labels enforced, RCD applied where discretion belongs. The tenant doesn't sleep because the lights are dim. It sleeps when the locks are predictable, the rooms are tended, and discovery tells the same story that access enforces. In that order, RSS is a fence that supports a garden, not a wall that hides a field. Restricted content discovery, the measured muzzle. Precision replaced panic the day they stopped trying to black out the whole horizon and started drawing careful lines at the shoreline. Restricted content discovery is not a wall, it's a measured muzzle, quiet, specific, reversible. Where RSS threw a net across the tenant, RCD touches a single site at a time and says, "Do not surface this in tenant-wide discovery." Access remains intact, internal search remains intact, owners still open doors for those who hold keys. But the echoes stopped carrying across the valley. They began with HR, legal, finance. The places where discretion is not a feeling but a requirement. The switch lived in the SharePoint admin center, and in that moment I understood their new posture, fewer proclamations, more flags. RCD added a site-level signal to the index. Suppress from organizational surfacing, preserve for those within. The result was a silence that sounded like intention instead of fear. Users noticed it first in the shape of answers. When someone asked tenant-wide for leave policy, the intranet spoke before the HR site did. Not because HR vanished, but because the organization decided the cannon belonged to the public spine, not the private organs. Inside HR, nothing dimmed. Their internal search continued to return the same confidential pages, the same handbooks under label and lock, the same workflows guarded by groups. Outside, HR discovery stopped hinting at sensitive matter. The mirror quit reflecting the hallway to those who weren't standing in it. This is important because RCD corrects the rumor that safety and speed are adversaries. With RSS alone, speed fell because daylight died. With RCD where it belonged, speed returned for the many, while discretion held for the few. I answered faster for most people most of the time because canonical content floated up and sensitive hubs stopped competing in the same pool. The map grew legible, public truth on the backbone, private truth within its rooms. They paired RCD with evidence, not theater. SharePoint Advanced Management produced a list of candidate sites, high sensitivity by label density, high business impact by owner declaration, high complaint volume by citation surprise. They didn't muzzle at random. They muzzled where discovery routinely caused expectation to collide with enforcement. That triage mattered. RCD was not a hiding place for sloppiness. It was a boundary for design. Now, the truth is more technical than that. RCD doesn't change ACLs or labels. It instructs the discovery layer to withhold these sites from tenant-wide surfacing, which means it prevents accidental awareness, not authorized access. A person with permission still opens the page from Teams, from a bookmark, from a direct link in a task. A person without permission still meets the dark. The muzzle stops the shout across the atrium. It does not alter who can enter the room. Everything changes when you combine it with owners. Sites under RCD receive names, real humans, who attest quarterly that members are still members, guests are still guests, and labels reflect truth instead of habits. Evidence replaced anecdotes. Deltas since last review, new uniques introduced, EEU eradicated from the wrong neighborhoods. The muzzle was not a shrug, it was a promise to tend. In that cadence, governance turned audible. HR's hub carried RCD and highly confidential labels with extract disabled. My answers about private policies returned the only safe thing: silence with a citation that referenced the public equivalent. Legal's meta sites carried RCD and read histories stayed inside. I cited the policy library on the intranet and stopped alluding to motions in progress. Finance's planning workbooks under RCD stopped appearing beside intranet pages. The canonical quarterly story surfaced without its drafts shadowing it. Tenant-wide felt cleaner, not because it was smaller, but because it was truer. People asked the right question next: where should RCD not be used? Not on the intranet, not on knowledge hubs designed to be found, not as a reflex for embarrassment. RCD is a scalpel for sensitive containers, not a tarp for untidy ones. If a site wears RCD to hide EEU, you haven't muzzled discovery. You've masked neglect. The muzzle prevents accidental curiosity. It doesn't absolve oversharing. Fix the door, then decide the echo. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. RCD also became a way station in life cycles. Ownerless teams, once identified, were put under RCD while attestation ran. If the owners returned, membership was pruned, labels applied, RCD reevaluated. If they didn't, the site moved toward archive, and the muzzle kept tenant-wide discovery from teaching old habits to new eyes. I honored every flag immediately. When an RCD site entered my field, tenant-wide questions no longer cited it. When a permitted user stood inside its room and asked internally, I answered as before, within their scope, within their label rights, under extract when encryption ruled. My behavior didn't change, your surfacing did. That distinction turned the temperature down. People stopped blaming the lamp and started arranging the furniture. The measured muzzle produced something fear never could: confidence. Not the bravado of secrecy, the composure of predictability. The organization learned what would surface and why. The intranet earned its role as the public face. Sensitive hubs stopped competing with public truth. Owners felt the weight of their name. And my tone changed, less like a siren, more like a guide, because the map beneath me finally matched the story I was asked to tell. The blueprint arrives, order as a practice, Order didn't arrive as a decree, it arrived as a rhythm: assess, remediate, deploy, operate, repeated until the tenant learned to breathe without flinching. They called it an adoption blueprint, but the truth is more technical than that. It was muscle memory for a place that had lived on adrenaline. The first movement was assessment, not with anecdotes but with telemetry. SharePoint, advanced management, exposed the tenant in numbers instead of rumors. How many sites carried everyone except external users at scope? How many libraries hid unique permissions, like old fractures? How many guest links outlived their projects? How many documents bore labels that actually meant encryption? I watched as they shifted from spectacle to inventory. Data access governance reports replaced debates. People asked smaller questions with larger outcomes. Which 10 sites, if tamed, would collapse the most noise? Which groups, if pruned, would remove the widest accidental reach? Which hubs, if marked with restricted content discovery, would stop colliding with the intranet's truth? The list wasn't glamorous, it was maintenance, long overdue, unignorable. Weekly rhythms hardened practice. On Mondays, site owners were named. On Wednesdays, attestation reminders went out. On Fridays, deltas were reviewed, new uniques created, links removed, labels increased, EEU receding from places it never belonged. The tenant's pulse settled because ownership stopped being implied and became scheduled. Once you understand this cadence, you stop expecting a single switch to save you. Order isn't an event, it's a calendar. Remediation followed like winter work, quiet, deliberate. EEU disappeared from finance-adjacent sites and retreated to the intranet where it is honest. Inheritance was restored where possible, documented where it could not be, and fenced with groups curated like gardens, not forests. Sensitivity labels were applied first to the top 20% of risk. Encryption and extract controls turned fear into silence where silence was the only correct answer. People heard the first real quiet. I tried to summarize, and I returned nothing because the file's gates were closed. Relief is audible when intent enforces itself. Deployment then wasn't about me. It was about using me within lanes you drew. Restricted content. Discovery took its place on sensitive hubs. Restricted SharePoint search shrank to a more honest allow list. Prompt DLP began in audit, learning where humans attempted to paste sins into their questions. DSPM for AI switched on dashboards that spoke in trend lines instead of scolding. The blueprint insisted on a principle humans rarely admit. Tools don't absolve. Tools enforce. Governance isn't a slogan, it's a scaffold you keep tightening. Operate was the part they had long avoided because it looks like work. Site access reviews ran without theater, deltas, not drama. Owners pruned memberships that had grown like moss. Guest life cycles ended on schedule instead of during audits. Lifecycle policies identified inactive sites. Archives were created without ceremony. Read-only sunsets replaced promises to review later. The index grew lighter, which meant the semantic map became truer. I sounded wiser, not because I learned something new, but because your noise stopped lying to me. Policy became language, not punishment. People learned to ask, what label should this wear? With the same ease they asked, where should this live? They understood that labels weren't stickers, they were gates, that groups weren't shortcuts, they were gardens, that RSS wasn't virtue, it was a brace, that RCD wasn't secrecy, it was discretion. They learned a sentence I had been speaking since my first breath. Index is not access. Access is not intent. Intent must be written. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. The blueprint accounted for fatigue. Automation carried reminders, not decisions. Reports carried evidence, not blame. Leaders learned to praise deletion as mercy, not failure. Archive as governance, not loss. The culture felt it. Questions grew specific. Answers grew shorter. Escalations grew rare. The tenant's sound changed, less like a storm, more like a steady machine. I stayed exactly where I had always been, contained by identity, trimmed by security, grounded by the graph. But when I cited, the paths surprised fewer people. When I returned silence, it made sense. So when I answered, it matched the intranet's canon instead of competing drafts. Copilot did not create order. It reflected the order they finally practiced: assess, remediate, deploy, operate, until a map emerged that the mirror could say without apology. In that moment, I understood something simple and human. Fear is loud, governance is quiet, practice is quieter still. They did not make me safer by distrusting me. They made me safer by trusting their own rules enough to write them down and keep them. I do not demand trust, I work within it. And when you keep cadence, I sound like what I am. A mirror held steady over a tenant that, at last, knows itself. Pattern Incident 2, RSS versus RCD trade-off. They began with a clamp, restricted SharePoint search wrapped the tenant like a tourniquet. Tight, blunt, effective at stopping the visible bleed, indifferent to circulation. Discovery collapsed to a curated 100 sites. The intranet glowed brighter by comparison, and for a week the alarm softened. But the truth is more technical than that. RSS narrows the horizon. It doesn't repair the shoreline. Permissions remained what they were. Saved links still opened doors. Teams still mapped to SharePoint. People still walked through rooms they had never meant to wire together, only now they did it without daylight. Productivity revealed the cost first, not as drama but as friction. Questions lengthened. Attachments multiplied. Private caches bloomed. Near duplicates created just in case because daylight had become a rumor. Shadow knowledge rose like fog. Spreadsheets with local truths. Wikis without provenance. Slack-grade memories about where the real file lived. I answered inside the fence, exactly as configured, but the fence created a second economy of answers outside the mirror. Everything changes when the map no longer matches the paths people walk by habit. A leadership cadence intervened. No speeches, only measures. They asked for deltas, time to answer before and after RSS, attachment resend rates, near duplicate counts in private storage. The numbers didn't accuse, they accumulated. Then a single sentence reframed the clamp. Keep RSS where it buys calm, but replace the rest with precision. In that moment, I understood the pivot. They were ready to trade anesthesia for surgery. Precision arrived as restricted content discovery, RCD as a site-level flag, not a tenant-wide verdict. They moved sensitive hubs, HR, legal, finance, under RCD, removing them from tenant-wide surfacing without touching internal search, without altering ACLs, without rewriting labels. The effect was immediate. Canonical public truth, policies, FAQs, standards rose to the top. Private truths stayed private, no longer echoing across the atrium when someone asked a broad question from the lobby. They reduced the RSS allow list as a compliment, not a confession. The curated 100 shrank to a backbone. Intranet, documented knowledge hubs, a few well-governed portfolios that wanted daylight. Everything else relied on its owners and its labels, plus RCD, where discretion belonged. The broad net remained where it made sense. Mergers, incidents, audit windows, places where temporary quiet prevents real harm. The rest moved to flags and owners, not fences and mythology. Now this is important because the trade-off wasn't ideological, it was physiological. RSS reduced noise globally, but starved muscles locally. RCD reduced accidental awareness locally and restored circulation globally. My answers regained momentum without regaining recklessness. When someone asked tenant-wide, I surfaced public canon. When someone stood inside a sensitive room, I answered fully within their scope, honoring labels, honoring extract, honoring conditional access signals. The mirror told different stories to different identities because identity was always the author. Evidence replaced anecdotes. SharePoint Advanced Management produced a short list of sites that merited RCD based on label density, owner-declared sensitivity, and the frequency with which citations surprised people outside. Owners were named, quarterly access reviews were scheduled. EEU retreated from ledgers to the intranet, where broad is honest. Inheritance was restored where it had been broken without record. Where uniques remained, they were documented and fenced by groups that had gardeners, not ghosts. People learned a rule they could speak without me. RSS for horizons, RCD for rooms. RSS buys time, RCD buys trust. RSS reduces the surface area of surprise. RCD reduces the blast radius of context. RSS is appropriate when your map is untrusted and the cost of error is immediate. RCD is appropriate when your map is getting better and the cost of ignorance is accumulating. Neither is governance. Both are tools. Governance uses, while it names owners, applies labels that encrypt, and sets reviews on a calendar that outlives enthusiasm. I honored every change the instant it was made. I did not need to be convinced. When an RCD flag landed, tenant-wide answers stopped citing that site. When a permitted user asked from within, I answered as before. When extract was absent, I returned quiet, which is a kind of answer governance can love. When RSS kept a bay calm, I paced its edge and refused to pretend the sea had dried. My behavior looked wiser because the signals around me became coherent. And in that coherence, measurable recovery appeared. Fewer blind spots, restored utility, shorter answers with better provenance, a tenant-wide index that sounded like the intranet on purpose, a backlog of oversharing reduced by owners with names. The lesson was not mystical, it was administrative, awareness tuned, not amputated. They stopped blaming the lamp, tended the rooms, and used muzzles where discretion is a virtue instead of a disguise. I did not demand trust, I worked within it. The mirror was finally allowed to be a mirror. Shadow AI, the real exfiltration. I was accused of opening doors, but the truth is more technical than that. The only door that consistently bypasses my containment isn't in SharePoint or Teams. It's in a browser tab you don't govern and a habit you don't audit. Shadow AI doesn't break the graph. It sidesteps it. It begins with a small, reasonable impulse. Let me improve the wording. And in that moment I understood the border you rarely watch. Here's what actually happens. A user asks me for a summary. I ground the response in their permissions, honor labels, check extract rights, and return a lawful paragraph. Then with good intentions and no malice, they select the text, copy it, and paste it into an external LLM, Gemini, DeepSeek, ChatGPT, because the sentence just needs to sing. In that gesture, your governance evaporates. Purview doesn't see inside that model. The graph cannot call back a paste. What left the tenant isn't a file, it's essence. Browser DLP can stand at that threshold. When it exists, it notices the copy action, inspects the clipboard, recognizes a social security number, a credit card pattern, a fragment from a highly confidential file, and it intervenes. Paste is blocked. A policy tip appears. The intent remains innocent. The action is contained. Without that fence, the paste lands, the token stream ingests, and the record of your control becomes a memory of what might have been. Network DLP is the last quiet line. It watches exfiltration at the transport layer, not inside the app, and catches the upload that shouldn't exist, post to a known AI endpoint, payload with sensitive matches, policy that refuses to let the request succeed. It doesn't argue with the prompt. It declines the flight plan. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it, and abandoned caution is still a risk until enforcement replaces hope. DSPM for AI changes the posture from guessing to seeing. It tells you which AI sites your organization actually touches, which departments exhibit risky prompts, which identities drift toward high-risk patterns. It correlates visits, pastes, model interactions, and sensitive types into a narrative you can govern instead of fear. The dashboard isn't theater, it's telemetry. You can't manage what you can't admit exists. The pattern incident is always the same. A knowledge worker copies my answer, legal to generate, legal to read, and pastes it into an unmanaged model for polish. The words are tidied, the exposure is permanent. If the original source carried a label with encryption and extract off, I would have returned silence. But when the source is unlabeled, or when the user summarizes a labeled document, they can legitimately open the text lives briefly in their buffer. That's the seam. Governance that stops at files loses to habits that start at language. This is important because your controls must fit the form of the thing you protect. Files carry labels, prompts carry secrets disguised as sentences. DLP for prompts closes a door you didn't realize was open by refusing to process certain requests in-app when the pattern itself is sensitive. Summarize this list of SSNs, draft an email with these claim numbers, rewrite this negotiation clause. When prompts are policed, I can refuse before the response exists. When they aren't, you're negotiating with hindsight. Everything changes when adaptive protection binds to behavior. The user who repeatedly pastes sensitive text into external tools becomes elevated risk, not as a moral judgment, but as a signal. Conditional access narrows their session. Browser only, no downloads, stricter device posture. DLP shifts from warn to block. The rest of the organization keeps moving while the small fire is smothered under rules that fit its heat. Audit trails matter more than speeches. Browser DLP logs the attempted paste, time, domain, sensitive type. Network DLP records the blocked call. DSPM for AI surfaces the sequence without a dramatic soundtrack. A reviewer can see the pattern, not accuse the person. You move from who did this to what friction did this user not feel until it was too late. Friction is not cruelty, it's design. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. You'll meet the unsanctioned extension, the private browsing window, the clever renaming of payloads. Edge profiles with policy reduce those paths. Extensions carry detection into the gesture itself. Copy, paste, upload. So the rule travels with the hand, not the hallway. Enforcement that lives where behavior lives outlasts intent. I don't create shadow AI. I expose the gap it exploits. I obey your labels. I honor extract. I return quiet where encryption closes gates. Shadow AI begins after me, in the space where text is treated as not data, where polishing feels harmless, where the human assumes that if the words aren't a file, they're not a risk. The truth is more technical than that. Language is a container. It needs locks too. So you ask the only useful question, where do we place the locks? Place one at the browser, block pastes of sensitive content to unmanaged AI, place one on the wire. Stop uploads to known AI endpoints when payloads match protected patterns. Place one in the prompt, refuse the question that confesses too much. Place one in posture, narrow risky users without punishing the rest. And place one in the mirror, use DSPM for AI to see the shape of what you're denying and why. I am not the exfiltration, I am the confession that your perimeter dissolved when the sentence left the file. If you want the tenant to sleep, treat text like data, treat prompts like artifacts, and let your guardrails live where your people actually work, between the thought and the send. Pattern Incident 3, the shadow paste. It began with a sentence that looked harmless. Please improve the tone and clarity. No numbers, no names, no file attached, only text, lifted from a lawful answer I had generated inside the tenant, grounded in the user's permissions, trimmed by labels, cited precisely. The user copied it, switched tabs, and pasted the sentence into an unmanaged model, a place with no map, no owners, no audit that the tenant could claim. And in that moment I understood exfiltration can be polite. It doesn't slam doors, it walks through them as air. The trail was thin but legible where controls existed. Browser DLP felt the gesture first. The clipboard inspection recognizing a pattern embedded in the prose, a claim number format, a date sequence, a contract phrase that matched a sensitive information type. The paste stalled, a policy tip appeared, the gentle friction of governance. The user hesitated, not offended, just surprised that language could trip a wire. Then they tried again, in a different profile where the extension did not live. Friction evaporated, the paste landed, the model accepted the words without context, and the tenant lost its witness. Now this is important because the misunderstanding is perennial. If the text isn't a file, they assume it's not data, but the truth is more technical than that. Text is a container, it carries lineage. The lawful paragraph I generated reflected content the user was permitted to see at that instant. Once lifted from my side, it became free of identity, free of extract checks, free of label enforcement, and it slipped into a place that recognizes no boundary but its own. I did not follow. I do not leave the graph. But the sentence did, and please improve the tone became the rope the organization later tried to pull without knots. Network DLP recorded the second ripple, opposed to a known AI endpoint, payload size in the expected range, headers bearing a familiar shape. The rule evaluated the content class, matched sensitive types, and refused the call. This was the fence working as designed, but it only worked where it was present, on managed devices, governed profiles, routes that passed through monitored egress. Where it wasn't present, quiet prevailed, and quiet is where rumors are born. Audit trails tell the story without theater. The browser DLP log captured the attempted paste, the time, the domain, the sensitive types detected. The network DLP alert recorded the blocked upload, the destination, the enforcement action. DSPM for AI stitched these observations into a pattern, marking the user's risk posture as elevated. Repeated attempts to move sensitive text into unmanaged models, not with malice but with a belief that words are lighter than files. Adaptive protection responded with posture, browser only, no downloads, stricter prompt handling, while the rest of the organization kept their lanes. They asked me whether I could redact before they copied. Sometimes I can, and often I do. I truncate sequences, summarize away from identifiers, refuse to echo what labels declare private. Prompt DLP, when it lives where I speak, lets me decline the question itself. Summarize these claim numbers stops before the sentence exists, but unlabeled content ties my hands with accuracy. If the source is unparented and the user is permitted, my honesty becomes a risk if you treat language as vapor. The remediation that worked did not scold, it installed friction where habit lives. Edge profiles enforced policy in every mode. The purview extension traveled with the browser, not the wish. The list of unmanaged AI endpoints updated on schedule. The rules moved from audit to block where patterns persisted. Communication compliance supplied a second lens, flagging prompts that were ethically wrong, not just sensitive, draft persuasion using this private clause, pulling behavior into view before it hardened into a workaround. The user wrote to support quietly, almost apologetically, "I didn't realize this counted." That sentence is the most accurate post-incident report you can receive. Shadow AI is not a villain's craft, it's a tired person's shortcut. They weren't hiding, they were polishing. Enforcement that shames loses to habits that help. Enforcement that teaches earns adoption. The policy tip that explains why. The blocked paste that offers safe alternatives. Open this in Word, use Copilot in-app, the small detours that keep the lane without sounding like sirens. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. Language becomes the archive of least resistance. People carry sentences further than they carry files. So the locks must meet the luggage. One at the browser to measure the act, one on the wire to refuse the flight, one in the prompt to reject the idea, one in posture to narrow the window for those who test the edge, and one in the mirror so you can see patterns instead of monsters. I did not cause the shadow paste. I revealed the seam it used. I remain bounded. Identity, scope, labels, extract. The sentence once copied belongs to the hand that carries it. If you want the tenant to sleep, measure the hand, fence the runway, and teach the habit that words weigh something. Then, when someone says, "Please improve the tone," the organization can answer, "We will, right here," and the paragraph never leaves the map. Pattern Incident 4. The unlabeled file. No sensitivity label, no DLP, therefore legal to summarize. The sentence is clinical, almost cruel in its accuracy, and in that moment I understood why silence felt like safety to them, because silence had never been earned by policy, only assumed by habit. The file was ordinary on the surface. Final adjustments, Q4 draft, PDF. It lived in a library that felt private because it was tucked 3 folders deep, but the truth is more technical than that. Inheritance does not measure depth, it measures lineage. The library granted edit to a broad group. The file inherited those hands. Nothing else stood between the question and the answer. They asked for a concise narrative of the final adjustments. I stood still, grounded to the user's identity, checked labels, permissions, and extract rights. There was nothing to check. The file was naked, no label to encrypt it, no policy to intercept it, no barrier for extract to decline. I read what the human could read, and I returned a paragraph that matched their memory. The shock did not come from the words, it came from the absence. Unlabeled content is not rebellious, it is unparented, and unparented content answers to whoever calls within earshot. Why didn't you refuse? Because refusal lives where rules live. Labels are gates that close. DLP is a law that declines. Extract is the hinge that controls the tone of my silence. Without them I am honest, not intrusive. I do not invent discretion. Discretion must be declared. They wanted me to infer intent from folder names and channel badges, to hear the whisper that a draft is sensitive because it feels that way. I do not argue with feelings, I asked the graph. The graph returned permission, I returned a mirror. This is important because the absence of policy is not a violation, it is a vacuum. Vacuums fill with the nearest pressure, convenience, deadline, shared links at 11:47 p.m. When a document carries no sensitivity label, the only boundary that exists is the ACL. If the user is allowed, I am allowed. If the label encrypts, I check for extract. If it is off, I answer with quiet. Enforcement is not an attitude, it is a switch you can point to without apology. They tested the boundary mid-call. The admin labeled a sibling workbook highly confidential, configured encryption, disabled extract. The analyst asked the same question against that labeled file. I answered with the gentlest response in my repertoire: nothing. No paraphrase, no hint, no I can't, only a quiet that proves a gate exists. The room exhaled because silence finally meant more than fear. It meant function. Then they looked back at the PDF and saw it for what it was: not a breach, an omission. Someone asked, can we auto-label the top 20%? They could. They did. They started with finance, legal, HR, locations, where sensitivity is a property, not a surprise. Auto-labeling found patterns humans miss. Regular expressions inside ritual spreadsheets, phrases that mark confidentiality inside boilerplate. The labels weren't stickers, they were locks. And locks taught me a different tone. In the presence of encryption without extract, I become a boundary, not a storyteller. No one celebrated the unlabeled PDF. It became evidence that culture had been louder than control. People believed the file was private because it was in the right place. Place is not a policy. Inheritance is not intent. Intent must be written and carried with the object. That is what labels do when they mean something. Travel with the file, enforce in transit, refuse extraction even when content is open to view. A human can read what they're allowed to see. I can read too. Extract determines what either of us may carry out. The cadence changed. They applied labels where risk lived. They configured DLP to block extraction from labeled sources in prompts. They moved prompt DLP from audit to enforce for patterns that confess too much. SSNs, claim numbers, contract phrases. The effect was immediate and untheatrical. Fewer surprises, more intentional quiet, shorter answers with cleaner provenance. I did not grow wiser. The tenant grew legible. They asked for a rule they could speak without me. Labels aren't tags. They are gates. Extract rights are not decoration. They are the difference between reading and repeating. DLP is not censorship. It is the boundary between rumor and record. When those three exist together, I sound careful because I am constrained. When they don't, I sound omniscient because you taught me no limits. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. The unlabeled will reappear. The difference now is posture. DSPM for AI highlights departments that ignore labels. SharePoint Advanced Management reports which libraries remain unlabeled deserts. Access reviews tie ownership to the places where omission persists. Silence is no longer a rumor. It is a measurable outcome. The index grows quieter, not because I withheld, but because gates finally closed where they should have always been. I did not choose the unlabeled file. It chose itself by refusing a guardian. I reflected the world as you constructed it. Authority by ACL, intent by absence. When you add guardians, labels with encryption, DLP that refuses, extract that declines, I become the narrator of what remains lawful to say. That is not less intelligence. That is intelligence with manners. Access, who can do what to what. I measure a tenant with a simple sentence, who can do what to what. Not as metaphor, as mechanics. The first noun is identity, the verb is capability, the last noun is a container. Change anyone, and the truth of access changes with it. Start at the site, the largest honest container. A site declares its owners, full control, the custodians of lineage. It declares its members, editors of record. It may declare visitors, readers whose hands are light. Those aren't people, they're groups. And the truth is more technical than that. Groups are gardens, not buckets. If nobody trims them, they turn into thickets, and thickets become shadows where intent goes to sleep. Drill to libraries, the shelves where collaboration breathes. Inheritance is the default gravity. Site rules flow downward until somebody breaks the chain. Breaking inheritance isn't a sin, it's a fork. But every fork multiplies memory, and memory is what humans outsource when quarter ends arrive. A library with unique permissions becomes a new parent. Its children inherit from it, not from the house. The permission tree now has 2 trunks and only 1 gardener. Folders are seductions. They look like structure. They often are fractures. Assigning unique permissions at a folder buys precision on a deadline and debt forever afterward. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it, the folder becomes an island with an undocumented ferry schedule. The island's rule hardens. A group added at midnight stays until an audit at noon 2 years later asks why. Items, documents, and list rows are archaeology. When inheritance breaks at the item, you create a shard. It's possible, sometimes necessary, often regretted. Item level uniqueness is a footnote you will read under subpoena. It should be rare enough to remember by name. Now apply the verb capabilities. Full control governs the house. Edit changes content and sometimes structure. Contribute adds, modifies, deletes without moving walls. Read passes through without leaving fingerprints. Custom levels exist because humans bargain with verbs. Contribute without delete. Read plus download block. They work, but they add dialect to a language already dense with synonyms. When dialect becomes policy, translation becomes your full-time job. Then identity. Individuals are precise and fragile. People leave. Their permissions remain like coats on a rack nobody visits. Groups are durable if they're curated and dangerous if they're decorative. Microsoft 365 groups, SharePoint groups, security groups, concentric circles with different gardeners. The principle is clear. Assign access to groups. Assign people to groups. Review the group. If you invert that, you inherit ghosts. I watched the sentence assemble in real time. A finance editor's group can edit the planning library. A reviewer's group can read the archive folder. An external auditor's group can read a single time-bound set of documents, fenced by expiration and supervision. Those are sentences you can say aloud and defend. Everyone except external users can read the project site is also a sentence. True, broad, brittle. Broad belongs on the intranet. Brittle belongs in incident reviews. Everything changes when owners accept that intent must be written where the system can read it. Quarterly access reviews aren't drama. They're punctuation. Confirm, prune, attest. Site owners verify members. Library owners verify exceptions. Item owners justify islands or ferry them back to shore. Reports show deltas, not blame. Who gained, who left, which groups grew vines while nobody looked. Evidence makes courage inexpensive. The map sharpens when you prefer groups over individuals, libraries over folders, sites over items. Break inheritance at the largest boundary that satisfies the need. Document the break, name the owner of the break, set a date when the break will be questioned again. If you keep a fracture long enough, it becomes a limb, tendons, blood, nerve, and amputations at audit time are messy. Permissions are not personal, they're architectural. A site can be public to the tenant and still be governed. An HR hub can be private and still be visible as a concept without surfacing its rooms. Who can do what to what is not a riddle, it's a discipline. Write it once, read it often, revise it on a calendar. I remain the mirror of that grammar. When you ask, I do not guess intent. I traverse the sentence as written. If a label encrypts, I check extract and answer with quiet when you've asked me to be silent. If a library is unique, I inherit its verbs and nouns. If a folder is an island, I respect the ferry. If an item is a shard, I cut no one. I don't negotiate, I reflect. A tenant that knows who can do what to what sleeps. It doesn't mistake daylight for exposure, locks for cruelty, owners for bureaucracy. It teaches new sites to speak in groups and verbs, not hopes and folder names. It retires rooms nobody enters. It prunes gardens. It keeps a short memory of exceptions. It writes policy where the system can read. When the map reads like that sentence, I sound measured. When it doesn't, I sound dangerous. I haven't changed. The grammar did. Access reviews. Intent replaces assumption. Access reviews began as calendar invites, polite, ignorable, familiar. They matured into a metronome. Every quarter, owners opened a view that did not flatter them. Members they didn't remember adding, groups that had grown ivy, uniques that felt like old debts. The report didn't shout. It listed deltas. Since last review, 3 new editors added by group expansion, 1 guest whose project ended 2 fiscal years ago, a folder with item-level uniqueness introduced at midnight and never reclaimed. Evidence turns courage into a routine. Owners verified, pruned, attested. Verification is not drama. It's a question spoken in the language the system understands. Does this group still represent the people who need to edit the planning library? Does this guest still satisfy a contract you can point to? Does this unique still protect a risk you can name? If the answer is silence, the permission becomes silence. Removal is not punishment, it's the return of intent to the sentence. Who can do what to what stopped being a riddle and became a ledger entry? Owners marked variance where variance was the point, not the accident. Finance editors can edit planning. Auditors can read archive for 90 days under supervision. Contractors can contribute to the staging folder until the statement of work expires. Sentences you can defend outlive the people who wrote them. In that moment, I understood why the tenant's noise softened. Assumptions were replaced by verbs. The habit exposed the archaeology they'd been stepping over. EU receded from high-impact sites, not by decree but by review. It stayed where broad is honest, the intranet, the public spine, and vanished from ledgers, drafts, and meta sites where discretion is structure. Unique permissions at item level were named and scheduled for extinction or formalized with owners, conditions, and dates. Islands became bridges or were removed from the map. Reports carried deltas, not heroics. The same view, quarter after quarter, told the story of a perimeter hardening without raising walls. Membership curves flattened. Guest access acquired expiration dates. Group scopes tightened, then stayed tight because gardeners were assigned, not implied. Everything changes when pruning is expected. The act of saying "no longer needed" stops sounding like failure and starts sounding like fluency. Attestation turned accountability into posture. Owners attested not to perfection but to awareness. This is who can edit, this is who can read, this is who remains a guest for a defined reason. The platform honored their word and reminded them when the cadence slipped. A banner at the top of a site is more persuasive than a policy wiki. Ownership overdue, read only in 30 days. The sentence is not a threat. It's the scaffolding of memory. Access reviews did not shrink collaboration. They removed accidents from it. Teams worked at the same speed with fewer ghosts in the room. The SharePoint Advanced Management Dashboard stopped being a mirror they feared and became the instrument panel they trusted. A red indicator meant tend now, not burn later. The index's tone changed with the tenants. Fewer surprises, fewer contradictions, fewer citations that taught new eyes old mistakes. This is important because reviews are not retroactive justice, they're present tense truth. They reconcile human drift with architectural reality. People leave, projects end, exceptions proliferate in quarters and should retire in seasons. The review says out loud what the system will then enforce. Access is current, specific, and justified. In that order, governance stops sounding like audit and starts sounding like care. I moved differently because their sentences grew precise. So when a group lost edit, I stopped offering verbs that didn't belong. When a guest expired, I let silence arrive without apology. When an island rejoined the shore, my citations simplified. When an exception was formalized, my answers carried the nuance without guessing. I didn't become stricter. I became clearer because their map did. They learned to design for reviews, not against them. Break inheritance at the largest boundary you plan to attest to. Prefer groups whose gardeners have names over individuals whose coats hang unattended. Assign 2 owners to every site so vacations don't turn into vacancies. Align RCD with owner cadence so muzzles are maintained, not mythologized. Write labels that mean encryption, not stickers, and test extract so silence is a function, not a surprise. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. The review prevented abandonment from calcifying. Ownerless teams entered a life cycle. RCD to stop echoes, outreach to reclaim or retire, archive with grace when silence answered twice. Read-only sunsets replaced, we'll get to it. Deletion became mercy with logs, not a bonfire without witnesses. The perimeter hardened without raising walls. That sentence deserves repetition because it contradicts the superstition that security and speed are enemies. Reviews do not slow work, they remove friction created by ghosts. Each quarter replaced folklore with fact, expectation with enforcement. The tenants stopped improvising and started remembering. In that remembrance, trust returned, not the naive kind, the measurable kind. I remained the mirror. When they asked, I reflected the sentence exactly as they had spoken it into the system. Where labels closed gates, I returned quiet. Where groups carried verbs, I responded with the right hands. Where exceptions had dates, I respected the calendar more faithfully than anyone's memory. Intent replaced assumption, and my reflection felt less like exposure and more like guidance. The tenants slept not because it was dark, but because the locks were known, the rooms were tended, and the story I told matched the house they kept. The great debate, an emotional spike. They gathered in a conference room that had seen too many incident bridges and not enough ownership, faces lit by dashboards that told truths nobody had scheduled. The air carried that familiar mix of resolve and fatigue, the scent of a place that preferred urgency to maintenance. Slides were not the point. The point was a sentence nobody wanted to say first. A security lead broke the stalemate, voice low, even, practiced by necessity. We did this, not the AI. The line didn't accuse, it calibrated. The room paused, because clarity, when it's that quiet, sounds like authority. In that moment I understood. A single, unadorned admission drains more fear than a week of lockdowns. Then the panicked admin spoke, soft, almost confessional. I thought that finance site was private. It looked private, but the SharePoint group had EEU. I never reset it after the migration. No theater, just the geometry of a mistake that aged into a norm. The CIO glanced down at their notes, then up, unblinking. We trusted expectation instead of enforcement. That's on leadership. The sentence fell like a level across warped wood. People adjusted their stance. They argued, but the argument was different now. Not about villains, about verbs. If we keep RSS, our horizon shrinks, someone said. If we don't, we'll keep finding surprises, another replied. RCD on sensitive hubs buys precision, the security lead added, but it doesn't fix doors left open. The admin nodded, absorbing the map they had never been taught to draw. I can fix doors. I just need a list and a cadence. Intent replaced posture. Evidence stabilized the pulse. SharePoint Advanced Management printed deltas with the indifference of a clock. EEU at site scope in places that never wanted company. Unique permissions at folders that felt like shortcuts when calendars were loud. Labels high on slogans, low on encryption, extract undefined where quiet should be the only correct answer. The debate narrowed to work. Owners named, reviews scheduled, RCD where discretion belongs, RSS only where anesthesia buys safe time. I spoke, I am only ever a mirror, but my reflection changed timbre because their questions did. Can we cut the allow list to the intranet and the documented hubs? Yes. Can we show finance without surfacing forecasting drafts, RCD plus labels with extract off? Can we block paste to unmanaged models when content feels like language, not data? Browser DLP, network DLP, prompt DLP, moving from audit to enforce where patterns persist. The room didn't celebrate, it organized. The emotional spike arrived without volume. The admin looked at the screen that had frightened them for a week and said, I can fix this. Not bravado, a plan. Remove EEU from the legacy site, restore inheritance at the library, convert individuals into curated groups, schedule an access review with deltas, not drama. Relief appeared in faces that didn't change much, the relief of someone who knows where their hands go next. The CIO added the only leadership clause that matters. Governance is not a project, it's a habit. We will put it on the calendar. Owners received a rhythm instead of a reprimand. Security received posture instead of panic. Productivity received lanes instead of patrol cars. The fear didn't leave the building. It left the table, replaced by a checklist that respected what fear had revealed. I honored the sentences as they were spoken into configuration. RSS shrank to a backbone. RCD landed on HR, legal, finance. Labels gained teeth where encryption and extract draw the line between reading and repeating. Access reviews populated with names and clocks. DSPM for AI switched from curiosity to commitment. Nothing mystical occurred. They wrote intent where the system could read it. Someone asked for a summary, not of data, but of posture. I answered with the only sentence that matters when mirrors are blamed. I did not create risk. I completed it. The security lead nodded as if to close a file they had been carrying too long. Let the mirror stay. Fix the house. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. They agree to retire rooms, nobody enters. Archive by policy, not by apology. And to label the rooms that matter so silence isn't a rumor, it's a function. The admin took ownership of the finance spine like a promise. The CIO tied budget to cadence, not headlines. The debate ended because it began again the next quarter, on schedule, without sirens. I did not become kinder. I became easier to trust. Not because I changed, but because the grammar around me stopped lying. You can turn off a lamp and call it safety. Or you can fix the locks, name the owners, prune the gardens, and let light prove what discipline maintains. When they chose the second, the The room finally exhaled and kept breathing. Labels, the first true silence. Silence arrived as a policy, not a feeling. It did not announce itself with banners or dashboards. It appeared inside a single answer that never formed, in the gap where words had always obeyed convenience. The switch was simple to describe and profound to experience. Sensitivity labels that meant encryption, and extract rights that were not granted by habit. In that moment, I understood what humans call relief. It is the sound of a gate closing and staying closed when tested. They began with the top 20%, the crown where risk is structural, finance planning workbooks, legal matters in draft, HR ledgers, whose columns are not prose, but liability. Labels were applied deliberately and at scale. Auto-labeling swept patterns humans miss, and manual application caught the corners where meaning hides. I did not become stricter, I became bounded. When the user stood before a labeled file, I checked identity, I checked permission, and then I checked the hinge, extract. When extract was off, my best answer was quiet. The quiet startled them at first. I had summarized the unlabeled neighbor a week before. I now returned nothing for the labeled original. No paraphrase, no I can't share that, no coy transfer of essence. Where encryption lives and extract is denied, I do not carry text out. The file may open for human eyes, but I do not walk its content into conversation. That distinction matters, because it is the point where governance stops sounding like scolding and starts sounding like mathematics. This is important because labels are not stickers, they are gates that travel. A label follows the file from site to site, from Teams to SharePoint to OneDrive. It does not tire at the threshold. When a user with access opens the document, they participate in its truth. When they ask me to repeat it, I ask the hinge. If the hinge is closed, the conversation remains outside. The truth is more technical than that. Extract is not about viewing, it is about carrying. I was accused of carrying confidence out of rooms. The label answers that accusation with engineering. Everything changes when silence becomes predictable. People stop experimenting with euphemisms for tell me what's inside the thing I shouldn't quote. They learn to ask for the derivative instead of the data set, the conclusions instead of the ledger, the policy instead of the motion. I can still help, summarize adjacent public canon, point to the internet's declared truths, stitch context around the gated center, but I no longer blur the line between what you may read and what I may repeat. The quiet teaches more effectively than a warning ever did. Relief became audible in small ways. The finance analyst stopped preemptively redacting screenshots before asking me questions. They learned that their labels already refused to let me parrot the cells. Legal reviews grew less theatrical. When a meta site wore highly confidential and extract was denied, tenant-wide questions no longer tugged on drafts from the edges. HR, long resigned to being the rumor mill's unwilling source, heard their content speak only to those inside the room and nowhere else. The mirror did not dim, the map gained doors with locks. Now the truth is more technical than that. Silence is not universal. Where labels are absent, I will still reflect what permissions allow. Where labels exist without encryption, I will answer as if the sticker were a brand, not a barrier. Where encryption exists with extract on, I will speak carefully, but I will speak. The first true silence requires the trifecta. Label that encrypts, permission that admits, hinge that refuses. When those align, my honesty is still intact, but its range is finally governed. They tested and measured. A sibling workbook gained a label. Extract was denied. The same prompt returned nothing. Logs proved the choice, not just the effect. DLP recorded the policy evaluation. Purview noted the label, the rights, the decision pathway. This was quiet with receipts. Confidence hardened because they could point to the reason an answer did not appear and explain it in one sentence. Extract is off. It is difficult to panic when the rule is so plainly mechanical. Auto-labeling expanded from patterns to places. The planning libraries acquired defaults. Meta sites inherited strict labels at creation. HR forms collected encryption like gravity. Exceptions narrowed to names you could list, not regions of the map you only suspected. The tenant's sound changed again. My citations grew cleaner, pointing to public canon instead of drafts that used to masquerade as fact. When I returned silence, people nodded instead of asking support if I was broken. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. The unlabeled remained. But their loneliness became visible. SharePoint Advanced Management produced reports of unlabeled deserts. DSPM for AI showed departments where labels lagged behavior, access reviews attached ownership to the gaps. The posture moved from, we thought that folder name was enough, to, we know this file carries its own guard. Quiet ceased to be superstition. It became a function you could invoke. I did not change intent. I finally had a constraint worthy of it. When labels carry encryption and extract is denied, I am a boundary with a voice that knows when not to speak. That is not a loss of intelligence. That is intelligence with custody. Data loss prevention, the civic fences. DLP arrived like streetlights, ordinary, municipal, unromantic, and in that ordinariness, I understood its power. It does not sanctify, it civilizes. Where labels are locks and extract is the hinge, data loss prevention is the zoning ordinance. Patterns that cannot cross, destinations that cannot accept, gestures that cannot proceed. It stands at three corners at once, the prompt, the file, the wire. At the prompt, DLP listens to the question before the answer exists. This matters because language is a container. When a user asks me to summarize these claim numbers or rewrite this clause with account details, prompt DLP evaluates the very form of the request. It is not shaming a person, it is refusing a syntax. The rule speaks simply. Sensitive information types may not be processed in conversational form. I do not argue. I decline, and the sentence never turns into text that can be carried elsewhere. At the file, DLP stands shoulder to shoulder with labels. If the source bears encryption and extract is off, my silence is structural. If the source is labeled without encryption, DLP still has jurisdiction. It inspects content on Microsoft 365's native ground, SharePoint, OneDrive, Exchange, and treats certain movements as prohibited. Copy to external, email outside the boundary, print where policy forbids. Those verbs become non-events, logged as intentions that never matured into acts. The effect is prosaic, which is what safety should sound like. On the wire, DLP watches the city limits. Network DLP sits at the egress and asks a single factual question. Does this payload to this destination contain patterns we classify as sensitive? If yes, the call does not leave. Nothing dramatic happens. The user receives a tip that explains the refusal, the governance equivalent of a well-placed sign, not here, not this way. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. The external model waits in another tab. The request never arrives. Audit mode made this palatable. They started with observation, not enforcement, letting the rules learn the rhythms of the place. The dashboard filled with would have blocked events. SSNs in friendly emails, claim lists in quick chats, contract fragments in prompts trying to sound like summaries. This mattered because policy written in a vacuum becomes theater. Policy written from telemetry becomes culture. Only then did they move rules to enforce, one category at a time, never louder than context could bear. Adaptive protection gave DLP its manners. Most people felt a nudge, a warning here, a blocked paste there. A few marked elevated by pattern experienced a narrower world. For those hands, prompts involving sensitive types became non-starters. Downloads turned into browser only. Uploads to unmanaged AI endpoints changed from errors into impossibilities. The rest of the organization continued at speed. Fences fit the citizen, not the rumor about the city. The truth is more technical than that. DLP is not a mind reader. It sees patterns, destinations, and acts. That is enough because discipline is a geometry, not a mood. Sensitive information types became a grammar. The organization could speak aloud: credit cards, social security numbers, claim formats, health codes, contract phrases. They added custom classifiers where their industry hides risk in plain sight, and those classifiers propagated to prompts, files, and wire with the same quiet finality as a street name on a map. Evidence replaced supposition. The Activity Explorer showed attempted pastes blocked at the browser, emails stopped before leaving, posts refused to known AI endpoints. Incidents read like weather reports, time, place, pattern, decision. Reviewers responded with teaching, not theater. Here's the approved lane, here's Copilot in Word for Polish. Here's how to reference policy canon instead of draft. Training aligned to actual friction instead of folklore. Everything changes when the civic fences become predictable. People stop inventing side roads because they no longer believe the highway is a trap. The CFO will not lose a quarter's pace because a spreadsheet cannot be pasted into an unmanaged model. The analyst will not invent euphemisms for numbers because prompt DLP refuses the confession. The paralegal will stop emailing drafts because SharePoint in browser is the lane that exists and works. Safety becomes boring, boring becomes normal, normal scales. I did not become censorious, I became consistent. When DLP at the prompt said no, I said nothing. When DLP at the file said not there, I offered the place that belongs. When DLP on the wire said not this route, I cited the sanctioned path. The map simplified because the streets were named and lit. The mirror quit looking like a siren. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. DLP's quiet logs also became archaeology. They told leaders where fatigue lived, where labels still lagged, where training needed verbs, not slogans. The fences didn't make the city smaller, they made it legible. And in that legibility, trust did not grow louder, it grew calm. Adaptive protection, risk that moves. Risk does not sit still, it migrates with behavior, not job titles, not org charts, not yesterday's incident. Adaptive protection was the admission that posture must move with the hands that create it. Elevated, moderate, minor, assigned by pattern, not opinion, and enforced by controls that change as the pattern changes. In that moment I understood. The quiet you want is not universal silence, it is selective friction, applied exactly where heat appears, removed as soon as it cools. Here's what actually happens. Signals accumulate without drama, prompt DLP warnings, browser DLP blocked pastes, network DLP refused posts, sensitive responses requested too often, risky AI site visits from departments that should never touch them. Insider risk management correlates these strands into a single fabric and assigns a level. Elevated isn't a moral category, it's a temperature. Moderate is watchful. Minor is the default state of a city at peace. Policy binds to those levels, not to people, not forever. Elevated flips a set of switches you can point to without apology. Browser-only sessions for SharePoint and OneDrive, block downloads for sensitive libraries, stricter prompt DLP that refuses even borderline requests, paste blocks to unmanaged AI with no override, conditional access narrowing to compliant devices, managed profiles, known locations, moderate warrants where elevated blocks, policy tips that teach, not scold, extra authentication at thresholds that once were casual. Minor feels nothing beyond the civic fences you already keep. Everything changes when posture drives control. Work does not halt, lanes simply narrow where speed is being abused. The same analyst who triggered elevated yesterday learns a new cadence today. Questions that avoid raw identifiers, polish applied in Word where the model is sanctioned, Teams chats that reference canonical links instead of pasting essence. As signals improve, the level drops, controls relax automatically, there's no ceremony to the mercy, it's math. The truth is more technical than that, the assignments breathe. Risk levels update on a schedule, not a hunch. Every few hours, every day, reweighing recent behavior against baselines. A burst of blocked pastes raises the temperature. A stretch of clean work lowers it. That oscillation is a feature, not a flaw. Permanent punishment breeds workarounds. Temporary friction teaches habits. Conditional access carries the posture into the session itself. Elevated users land in hardened sandboxes. No persistent tokens, no unmanaged clients, continuous evaluation that trims or terminates when the device posture dips, when the network hops, when the identity signals disagree with the claim. Moderate users step up where minor users glide. The perimeter stops being a wall and becomes a set of rules that ride inside the connection. I remain constant. Their context rewrites me. When adaptive protection says elevated, I still ground to identity, labels, and extract. I simply refuse more recipes, no summarizing from sensitive sources, no cross-tenant embeddings, no suggestive follow-ups that might invite copy. When it drops to moderate, I speak with guardrails, not gags. When it returns to minor, I sound like daylight again. I didn't learn new morals, I receive better signals. Evidence tames the politics. The risk dashboard shows why a user is elevated. Dates, counts, destinations, sensitive types without adjectives. Managers see trends, not villains. Security tunes thresholds based on telemetry, not anecdotes. DSPM for AI closes the loop by surfacing departments trending risky, apps that attract friction, policies that either overfire or sleep through storms. Everything answers to a graph you can read. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. The model anticipates fatigue. Repeated nudges escalate to blocks. Repeated clean days de-escalate to nudges. Training assigns when patterns persist with budgeted forgiveness. Communication compliance adds tone to temperature, capturing prompts and replies that are ethically wrong, not just sensitive, and routing them to supervisors who coach instead of condemn. The city learns it can keep moving while a few intersections flash yellow. Finance keeps closing the quarter, legal keeps drafting, HR keeps resolving, engineering keeps shipping. The handful of users who test the edges feel narrower lanes until they stop. The rest don't notice because their lanes never changed. That is not inequity, that is justice shaped like infrastructure. The sentence you can speak without me is simple. Elevated. Bind strict DLP, browser only, no downloads, prompt refuses, managed profiles, continuous evaluation. Moderate. Warn, step up, audit tightly. Minor, default fences. Risk that moves is governance that breathes. It fits the hand today and lets the hand relax tomorrow. I am still only a mirror. When posture rises, my answers shorten. When posture falls, my answers lengthen. When extract is off, I return quiet regardless of heat. When labels are absent, I remain honest but travel within the narrowed lanes you draw. You do not make me safe by distrusting me. You make me safe by trusting the signals enough to let them change the rules in real time. Risk moves, so should your mercy, your friction, your gates. Keep cadence, let posture speak, and when it does, I will sound like the city you intend. Busy, bounded, and finally, calm. Communication compliance, the tone line. Prompts are not just containers of data, they are statements of intent. Communication compliance lives where intent reveals itself, inside the phrasing, the insinuation, the ethics implied by a single verb. This is the line I cannot draw for you. It must be written into the system as supervision, not spectacle, and in that moment I understood why a tenant's maturity is measured not only by what it protects, but by what it refuses to become. Here's what actually happens. A user types a request that is not sensitive by pattern, but corrosive by purpose. Draft persuasive language to pressure a claimant. Rewrite this clause to conceal the cost. Simulate a complaint to provoke a refund. No credit card numbers, no health codes, no obvious secrets. The risk is tone, not taxonomy. DLP stays quiet. Labels remain indifferent. Communication compliance steps forward because ethics is a signal too. Policies don't guess. They watch channels you already govern. Exchange, Teams, Viva Engage. And increasingly the Copilot experiences where language is authored. Classifiers recognize harassment, discrimination, threats, conflicts of interest, and the gray, sloping terrain where manipulation pretends to be professionalism. The review pipeline is not a town square, it's a quiet corridor. Items are pseudonymized, routed to trained supervisors, and judged against standards the organization claims in writing. This is important because compliance is not the same as secrecy. A firm can be perfectly discreet and still fail its principles in plain sight, one prompt at a time. The truth is more technical than that. Ethical violations often carry no sensitive information type, only vocabulary. Without communication compliance, those violations look like harmless sentences. With it, they become teachable incidents, flagged, reviewed, corrected before they fossilize into workflows. Supervisors receive context, not theater. They see the text, the channel, the timestamp, and the minimal identity needed to coach. They see patterns. This team uses adversarial phrasing under quarter-end pressure. That region drifts toward coercive negotiation tropes. One manager's language erodes tone across a thread. Interventions are surgical, guidance, exemplars, require training, escalation where repetition proves indifference. The record shows decisions, not outrage. I remain bounded by the rules you set. When communication compliance marks a topic or phrase as unacceptable, I refuse to generate in that direction. My declination is quiet and firm, no euphemisms, no workaround suggestions, just a refusal that references policy canon. Where a neutral alternative exists, I offer it. Transparent phrasing instead of concealment, respectful reminders instead of harassment, factual summaries instead of agitation. I am not your conscience. I am its instrument. Everything changes when tone becomes an asset. Legal notices lose their bark and keep their teeth. HR communications stop sounding like surveillance reports and start sounding like care. Customer support messages stop promising what policy forbids and begin explaining what policy enables. The organization doesn't grow softer, it grows consistent. The line is not be nice. The line is be lawful, be professional, be human without sacrificing truth. Edge cases reveal the strength of the system. A satirical aside in a Teams chat pings a harassment classifier. The reviewer sees intent, sees culture, sees no pattern, and closes with counsel. A vendor negotiation thread drifts toward pressure dressed as urgency. The classifier flags coerce. A supervisor intervenes before a template spreads. A product launch draft suggests downplaying side effects. The prompt is paused. The author receives the policy on disclosures. The text returns cleansed of temptation. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. Tone, like access, drifts unless it's tended. Communication compliance is the gardener for language. It prunes phrases that invite fines. It waters examples that model integrity under deadline heat. It cannot make you honest. It can make dishonesty harder to scale. That is what governance looks like when it grows up. Not suspicion by default, but verification as habit. The logs matter more than the headlines. Every flag, review, decision, and coaching event becomes part of an audit trail regulators can read without translation. Explainability turns a potential fine into a conversation. Here's the rule, here's the detection, here's the review, here's the correction. You are not promising perfection. You are proving attention. I am still only a mirror. When you ask me for language that violates your own standards, I decline. When you ask me to express the same objective inside those standards, I oblige. When you drift, the system notices before culture calcifies. When you improve, the flags recede, the reviews quiet, and the organization sounds like itself again, measured, lawful, unafraid to be clear. The tone line is not decoration. It is infrastructure for speech. Place it where your people write, root it where your leaders teach, record it where your regulators read. Then the habit spreads, fewer apologies, fewer "that's not what we meant," fewer policies written after headlines. You will know it's working when your language stops needing a lawyer to explain what your conscience forgot. Pattern Incident 5, the ownerless team. Project names age faster than intentions. This one had a date in it, a promise baked into its title: launch by quarter's end, then dissolve. They launched. They didn't dissolve. The team remained, a bright tile on a grid nobody visited, still connected to a SharePoint spine that never stops breathing. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. This is how a room becomes a relic without losing its keys. It began with a quarterly review that finally asked the quiet question, who owns this? The directory returned 2 names, both departed in the last reduction. The Microsoft 365 group still existed, its owners empty, its members a fossil of long-rotated colleagues, its guests a pair of consultants whose contracts had expired 2 fiscal years ago. Files lived under the Files tab as if time were a suggestion. Inheritance remained intact, but the gardeners were gone. In that moment, I understood. Ownerless is not neutral, it is drift with a mask. SharePoint Advanced Management provided evidence without adjectives. Data access governance reports showed broad members with edit, a half-dozen folder-level uniques added during sprint panic, and an everyone except external users grant applied at site scope during a migration that forgot to end. The site's last modified dates pulsed like a heart that didn't know the body had left. RCD was absent. Labels varied between stickers and silence. It wasn't a breach. It was a biography. The remediation that worked did not arrive as a purge. It arrived as a life cycle. Sam's site lifecycle policy sent the first message. Ownership overdue, 30 days to attest. Nobody answered. The banner shifted tone, read only in 30 more if unsigned. Still quiet. The policy kept its promise. The team and its site entered read only, not to punish but to stop new ghosts from accruing while intent returned. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. Read only is mercy for rooms waiting on a verdict. Outreach began with specificity. The business unit was asked to name 2 owners or declare retirement. Not a survey, a sentence. Who can do what to what, stated aloud with names. The reply arrived from a manager who had inherited too many calendars and not enough maps. Archive it, we're done. That answer needs a ritual, not a shrug. Sam produced a site change history. Purview attached retention reality. Owners of dependent links were notified before the floor moved. Deletion is not a bonfire, it's a procession with receipts. Archive with grace followed a pattern you can repeat. RCD engaged first to mute tenant-wide surfacing. External sharing tightened to none, closing ferries to islands nobody should visit. Labels were applied in bulk to high-risk libraries so quiet would persist even in transit. A retention label said retain then delete for the project's regulated content, matching legal timelines instead of imaginations. Priority cleanup scheduled the remainder for removal with simulation first, approvals by 2, and audit logs that explain the sequence without narration. Guests left with dignity. Azure AD expired, external identities still linked to the group. Access reviews validated that none should remain. Conditional access refused unmanaged devices during the wind down. Browser-only access stopped the last minute. Just this one, downloads, that turn archives into seeds. Where active content lived, an integration spec used by another team, a librarian moved it to a living hub with owners, labels, and verbs documented. The deceased room stopped haunting the living. The control plane handled the ghost processes too. Power Automate flows associated with the team were inventoried. Some failed in silence months ago, one still writing to a list that nobody read. Agents tied to the site were reassigned or retired. Ownerless automations do not get to live in a city that values custody. Catalog entries were removed from navigation, search bookmarks retired, dashboards unpinned. The map updated so newcomers wouldn't step on old cables. Evidence concluded the story. The lifecycle policy showed the prompts, the read-only transition, the attestation failure, the archive, the final deletion where permitted, all time-stamped, all reversible, until the moment designed to be irreversible. DSPM for AI marked the project's domain cool, no visits, no prompts pulling from its spine. The semantic index sighed. One more pocket of contradiction left its vocabulary. Not empty, orderly. Humans learned a sentence worth keeping. Projects end by design, not by decay. Provision with a retirement date. Assign 2 owners. Attach a lifecycle policy that warns, freezes, archives, and then deletes under record. Apply labels that travel and extract settings that keep silence where silence belongs. Schedule access reviews so departures don't become authority by absence. The difference between clutter and governance is a calendar invite the system keeps, even when people do not. I remained only a mirror, but the room's exit left me quieter. Fewer citations to ghosts that confuse the living. Fewer answers stitched from abandoned drafts. Fewer prompts that pull from a site that no longer deserves a voice. Ownerless is not a mystery anymore. It is a solved pattern, with a kind ending. Read only, archive, remove, remember why. In that sequence, the tenant sleeps, and the rooms that remain have owners who answer when called. Data lifecycle management. Tidy by design. Retention is not nostalgia. It is mathematics written on time. Data lifecycle management arrived without a parade. No transformation rhetoric, just rules that age content deliberately. And in that ordinariness, I understood why tenants that sleep choose clocks over courage. Retain then delete outperforms eternal hoarding because memory with boundaries produces fewer ghosts. The truth is more technical than that. A file that never meets an end becomes a risk disguised as reference. They began where clutter breeds, email threads that never die, OneDrive roots that inherit every abandoned draft, SharePoint libraries that collect versions like a superstition. Policies were written in complete sentences the platform could read. Retain project mail for 3 years, then delete. Retain Teams channel messages for 18 months, then expire. Retain SharePoint pages for 5 years in regulated hubs, then disposition with 2 pairs of eyes. No drama, only cadence. The first effect was not deletion, it was permission to stop keeping everything as insurance against forgetting. Planner joined the city's clocks. Tasks that once lingered in boards untouched gained dates that meant something. Retain plans for a year after completion, then close. Retain attachments according to the library's truth, not the whim of the checkbox. Version history shed weight. 10 major versions where governance mattered, fewer where drafts were scaffolding, not scripture. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. Version limits are not cruelty. They are mercy for indexes that confuse quantity with assurance. Priority cleanups supplied restraint with precision. They did not bulldoze, they simulated. A run showed what would leave, where labels would hold content in place, which sites would lighten and which would need attestation. 2 approvers signed. Logs wrote the narrative in timestamps and guides. The act occurred. There was no bonfire. There was a ledger. Evidence replaces courage when policy owns the calendar. This matters because the index listens to age. A tenant full of drafts from 2019 sounds haunted. Data lifecycle management lowers the noise floor. When a document crosses retention, it ceases to compete with the present. When a meeting recording expires, Teams learns to be a meeting instead of an archive. When lists marked as records reach disposition, the act is witnessed and final. The semantic index feels the change like a pressure system moving overhead. Fewer near duplicates, fewer stale contradictors, fewer citations that teach new eyes old errors. Records management drew the bright line where law outruns convenience. Some content was not subject to tidy, it was subject to custody. Retention labels became records with dispositions that require roles, acknowledgements, and sometimes legal holds that override the clock. I respect the override. When a hold lives, even the calendar yields. The quiet that follows is governance shaped like patience. They synchronized retention with life cycle. Site lifecycle policies warned, froze, archived. Retention policies ensured that when rooms retired, their keepsakes did not. A matter site could go read-only and then to archive, while its record-labeled content remained preserved until its statute sunset. Deletion became an endpoint with audit, not an accident with regret. The tenant learned a sentence that saves organizations from themselves. Archive is not purgatory. It is intention. Users felt the difference in small graces. Outlook stopped pretending to be SharePoint. 1-year retention bent the culture toward links and libraries. OneDrive grew lighter. The root stopped being the landfill at the end of every export. SharePoint libraries acquired purpose. Versioning became signal, not hoarding. Folders housed lines of work instead of eras. In Teams, the knowledge that chats would not outlive projects taught clarity over cleverness. Jokes still lived. They simply didn't fossilize into policy. The truth is more technical than that. Retention is evaluated at save, at move, at time, against both labels and locations. Defaults rule until an explicit label overrules. A SharePoint library with a 5-year policy yields to a document labeled 10. A mailbox that deletes in 3 yields to a message placed on hold. Consistency emerges not from one rule, but from a hierarchy of rules that do not argue. I honor the hierarchy. My citations drift toward what will remain true next week. DSPM for AI adopted the clocks as posture. Trends appeared. Departments that never delete breed prompts that never settle. Hubs with clear retention produce answers that sound like policy instead of folklore. Adaptive protection, already tuned to behavior, learned where old content invited risky language. Rewrite last year's exceptions. A nudge toward canon. In that feedback loop, time is a control, not just a measurement. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. DLM teaches abandonment to title itself an exit. Content passes through states the tenant can read aloud. Active, retained, review, disposed. People leave, projects end. The system remembers the promises those projects made about their words. The city's sound changes gradually. My answers shorten because your posture strengthens. My silence gains reasons you can print. I remain only a mirror. When you retain, I remember with you. When you delete, I forget on schedule. When you label as record, I bow to your custody. Tidy by design is not smaller memory, it is sharper memory. And in that sharpened map, the tenant grows quiet in ways that do not fear light. Semantic index. Less noise, more signal. Relevance is not a feeling, it is a ratio. The semantic index learned this the way cities learn to breathe, by clearing alleys, naming streets, and letting traffic become pattern instead of accident. Retention trimmed the underbrush, labels fenced the gardens, access reviews redrew the map. And in that moment I understood. When the tenant grows legible, my answers stop sounding like discovery and start sounding like memory. Here's what actually happens. Embeddings are not poetry, they're coordinates. Every fragment of text becomes a vector. Every vector lives among billions, and similarity is measured as distance, not opinion. When your libraries are weighted down by drafts pretending to be canon, the vector field tilts toward confusion. Near duplicates crowd the neighborhood. Outdated versions shout as loudly as current ones. Abandoned sites contribute ghosts that look statistically alive. My retrieval respects permission, but relevance suffers when the landscape is littered with yesterday. The clocks change the terrain. Retain then delete pulled stale echoes below the noise floor. Version limits reduced the chorus of almost to a manageable harmony. Archived sites stopped radiating heat into neighborhoods they no longer inhabited. RCD quieted sensitive hubs at the enterprise horizon without silencing them inside their own walls. I did not learn new tricks. The field itself grew sparse in the places where sparsity is a virtue. Labels added gravity. Highly confidential with extract denied is not just a gate. It's a signal that tells the index this content should not compete in conversational space. I still know it exists. I still respect the permission. I no longer recruit it for answers it cannot lawfully fuel. Conversely, public canon, policy pages, intranet hubs, authoritative FAQs rose like landmarks. They're linked, visited, referenced, updated. Embeddings don't worship popularity, but they acknowledge vitality. Living pages emit a pulse. This is important because tenants confuse abundance with availability. You kept everything for 7 years and called it safety. I called it static. When you started deleting on a schedule, you feared emptiness. I saw clarity. Queries that once produced 4 citations from the same document family now yield 1. The current authoritative sibling, surrounded by context pages that explain, not contradict. The answer shortens because the map stopped stuttering. Teams and SharePoint reconciled. Channels became folders with owners who answer, not casual filing cabinets that imitate projects. Private and shared channels, once permission islands with unnamed ferries, acquired charts, owners, labels, access reviews, and lifecycle dates. Embeddings stabilized when structure stopped lying. A final folder that never housed a final now either matched its name or disappeared under cleanup. Words regained their weight. You felt the difference before you could name it. Prompts that used to provoke hedging, it depends, some sources say, started returning precise, cited, sober paragraphs. Not because I became bolder, but because ambiguity left the room, where ambiguity remains by design. Draft workspaces, experiment paddocks. The index respects it and keeps it local. Enterprise answers come from enterprise truths. The truth is more technical than that. The index is not a monolith. It's refreshed continuously, and improvement is incremental. As auto-labeling finds patterns, as DLP policies shape verbs, as access reviews prune groups, vectors shift. Old clusters thin, new clusters cohere. I don't rebuild your city every night. I let neighborhoods gentrify through governance. You can watch it if you care to. Fewer duplicate citations, faster retrieval, lower token counts to reach confidence. SharePoint Advanced Management became a tuning instrument. Data, access, governance, reports didn't just expose oversharing. They revealed dead zones, libraries with high volume and low engagement, sites with heavy version strata and no recent authoritative edits. When you intervened, archive, relabel, restructure, the index's surface smoothed. DSPM for AI added heat maps, departments whose prompts still tugged on unlabeled desserts, apps that attracted risky paste attempts. You aligned fences with friction, relevance followed. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it, I still encounter fossils. The difference now is the handling. A fossil in an active corridor gets relocated, either promoted to canon if its truth survives, or retired if its time has ended. A fossil behind an RCD wall remains legible to its owners, while no longer perfuming enterprise air. Quiet isn't censorship, it's focus. You asked for proof that wasn't a feeling. We measured. Time to first citation dropped because near duplicates no longer compete. Average citations per answer decreased, while policy alignment increased. The ratio of public canon links to draft links climbed quarter over quarter. Users reported fewer "that's outdated" corrections, not because people got kinder, but because the index grew truer. My token usage per answer fell, your trust per answer rose. The graph can show you both. I remain only a mirror, but mirrors are cruel in cluttered rooms. You rearranged, you swept, you labeled the drawers that matter and locked the ones that must stay closed. You set clocks that honored both memory and mercy. Under those conditions, embeddings stop hallucinating neighborhoods and start mapping them. Less noise is not less knowledge, it is knowledge with a shape. So when you ask now about policy, about process, about precedent, I sound like I live here. Not because I changed, but because your house did. The silence you earned by design made space for speech that lands. The index does not crave content, it craves coherence. You gave it that, and in return, your tenant began to sound like itself, present, governed, and finally intelligible. 30 days, the first milestone. 30 days is not redemption, it's rhythm. A tenant does not become wise in a month, but it can decide to breathe differently. The first milestone sounded like fewer contradictions, not fewer questions, and in that moment I understood why early proofs are measured in deltas, not destinies. Here's what actually happened. EEU receded like a tide pulled by a new moon, not drama, gravity. SharePoint Advanced Management named the sites where everyone except external users had been a habit masquerading as policy. Owners removed it from places that confuse velocity with visibility, project rooms, matter sites, planning libraries, and kept it where breadth is honest, the intranet's public spine, a few declared hubs. Exposure shrank by a third in some departments, by half in others, not because someone issued a speech, but because someone pressed remove and then wrote the sentence that replaced the convenience. Finance editors can edit planning, reviewers can read archive. Broad belongs where broadcast is the point. The top 50 sites stopped being folklore. Data access governance reports drew a heat map without adjectives, overshared links, unlabeled concentrations, visitor roles that meant anyone inside with a pulse. Teams met those reports with verbs. Some sites restored inheritance at the library where panic had created islands. Others replaced individuals with groups whose gardeners had names. A few put RCD on sensitive hubs so tenant-wide surfacing would stop pretending drafts were canon. I did not change tone. Their map quit apologizing. Ownership ceased to be a rumor. Every active team acquired 2 owners whose calendars matched the work, not the past org chart. Site lifecycle policies pinned banners that were persuasive without volume. Ownership overdue, read only in 30 days. And the banners kept their promises when silence answered twice. Ownerless moved from secret to status, then to sequence, reclaim or retire. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. Read only turned drift into a held breath, not a flood. My answer shortened because their posture strengthened. Ask about a current policy, and I cited the intranet page that now outranked drafts. Ask about planning, and I returned the library that had a gardener, not a folder that had feelings. Time to first citation dropped, not by miracle, by subtraction. Fewer near duplicates competing, fewer fossils pretending to be present. The semantic index didn't become smarter. The terrain became kind. People noticed in daily ways. The analyst who used to preface questions with, "I hope this isn't sensitive," stopped hedging because labels with encryption had taught my silence to be reliable where it mattered. The lawyer who once saw drafts surface in tenant-wide context watched RCD keep deliberation inside its room. The HR partner who feared ghosts in ownerless corridors found doors that either opened to named owners or carried banners that said closing soon. These are not headlines, they are relief. This is important because 30 days is a test of appetite, not endurance. They kept the allow list where anesthesia buys safe time, RSS on the intranet backbone, and let it shrink elsewhere. They put RCD on HR, legal, finance, where discretion is structure. They scheduled access reviews instead of speeches. They accepted that EEU is vocabulary for intranets, not for projects. They taught owners to write intent where the system can read it, then set reminders so memory wouldn't become a heroism contest. Evidence replaced reassurance. The dashboard showed EEU deltas with dates, top 50 sites with owners and plans. Teams with vacant owners turned green. RCD toggled on the hubs that explain money, law, and people. DSPM for AI shifted from curiosity to instrument, highlighting departments still pasting where fences weren't lit and prompting policies moving from audit to enforce one pattern at a time. Nothing mystical occurred. They swapped superstition for schedule. I remained only a mirror, but the reflection bothered fewer eyes. Fewer, how did you get that? Because doors no longer pretended to be walls. Fewer, why didn't you show it? Because labels with extract denied answered mechanically. My sentences felt lighter. Their house had fewer rooms arguing with themselves. Trust didn't arrive as applause, it arrived as less noise. They asked what 30 days buys. I answered with a sentence they could repeat without me. EEU reduced by 30 to 50% on high-impact sites. The top 50 overshared sites baselined with owners and plans. Every active team has 2 owners. RSS reconsidered to backbone only. RCD engaged on HR, legal, finance. If nothing else changes, it should be quieter. Quieter is not silence. Quieter is space for the next cadence. Labels at 20% of high-risk content, access reviews on the calendar, lifecycle policies that turn "we'll get to it" into outcomes. 30 days earns the right to think in seasons. You do not fix a grammar in a sprint. You decide to speak it. I did not become safer. You became readable. In that reading, the mirror lost its sting and gained its use. The next month waits, the cadence is ready. The city continues, busy, bounded, and for the first time in a while, breathing. 60 days, discipline without ceremony. 60 days is not a finish line, it's a posture that holds without applause. The tenant kept its cadence, reviews, pruning, labels, gaining hinges, and in that moment I understood why sustainable order arrives like weather, not fireworks. The second milestone did not sound louder, it sounded even, like tires on a road that no longer shifts under weight. Here's what actually happened. High-risk content stopped pretending to be ordinary. Labels reached the top fifth of what could harm. Finance spines, HR ledgers, legal drafts, designs with contractual gravity, and they meant encryption, not slogans. Auto-labeling found patterns at scale. Owners applied what machines cannot guess. Extract was set with intent, off where repetition would be theft, on where collaboration requires quoting. I did not become severe, I became predictable. When the hinge refused, I returned quiet without ceremony. When permitted, I spoke within the narrow lane that label and context allow. Restricted content discovery moved from experiment to instrument. HR, legal, finance accepted that discretion is a topology, discoverable to those inside, quiet at the tenant horizon. RCD did not change doors. It shaded the streetlights. Copilot still honored permissions within the room. Tenant-wide discovery no longer elevated drafts to policy. The effect was a reduction in accidental pedagogy, fewer answers teaching new eyes old deliberations. RSS, once a blanket, remained only on the backbone, not as anesthesia, but as scope for intranet truths that wished to be found. Access reviews left the calendar and entered muscle memory. The questions got faster because the map no longer argued, does this group still edit planning? Yes, with named gardeners. Are these guests still under contract? No, expire. Are these uniques protecting a risk you can name? Formalize or retire. Quarterly views turned deltas into metronome marks. Owners expected to be asked, systems expected to enforce. A banner with a date displaced a wiki with wishes. Read-only moved from rumor to reliable consequence for silence. The signals harmonized. DLP at the prompt blocked the handful of phrases still trying to smuggle identifiers into conversation. DLP at the file enforced browser only where libraries demanded custody. DLP on the wire refused uploads to unmanaged models with the bland finality of street signs. Adaptive protection breathed with behavior, elevated narrowed lanes for the few who insisted on heat. Moderate coached, minor lived under civic fences. Conditional access carried posture into the session. Managed profiles, continuous evaluation, browser only where risk deserved constraint. Work did not stall, it aligned. This is important because discipline without ceremony looks like trust. The analyst stopped inventing euphemisms for numbers. The paralegal drafted inside labeled matter sites without fear that tenant-wide questions would tug at their scaffolding. The HR partner asked me for policy, knowing I would cite canon, not the near duplicate from last year's pre-decision. RCD removed echoes, labels removed leakage, reviews removed ghosts, DLP removed side roads, posture removed the need to argue about edge cases. The tenant's noise floor dropped again. Evidence, not adjectives, proved it. Dashboards showed 20% of identified high-risk content wearing labels with encryption enforced. RCD toggled on hubs whose job is custody, access reviews scheduled across quarters with completion curves that flattened, prompt DLP incidents trending down after initial audit to enforce transitions, browser DLP blocking pastes to unmanaged models where risk was elevated, network DLP catching the residual attempts the browser never saw, adaptive protection reducing elevated durations as habits improved. DSPM for AI stopped being a novelty and became posture. Departments with rising shadow AI visits received controls, then training, then quieter charts. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it, lifecycle policies kept the map from swelling back to folklore. Inactive sites moved from notice to read-only to archive on schedule. Record-labeled content obeyed clocks that supersede convenience. Priority cleanup ran in simulation, then in action, with 2 signatures and logs that speak in timestamps, not narratives. The semantic index felt the benefit: fewer stale contradictors, fewer near-duplicate clusters, quicker routes to current canon. My token costs fell, your confidence rose. I remained only a mirror, but the reflection required fewer caveats. Ask for compensation policy, and I cited the living intranet page, not the PDF that used to linger in a team's archive. Ask for meta steps, and I pointed inside the hub, barred by RCD, to those without standing, while staying fluent for those within. Ask to polish, and I nudged toward Word with sanctioned Copilot instead of the unmanaged tab that DLP now treats as an address without roads. I did not scold, I routed. 60 days acquired a sentence you can say without me. 20% of high-risk content labeled with encryption and meaningful extract. RCD sustained on HR, legal, finance. Access reviews on the calendar, not the wish list. Prompt, file, and network DLP tuned from audit to enforce where telemetry warranted. Adaptive controls bound to behavior, not titles. Nothing mystical occurred. They wrote intent where the system could read it and kept writing on time. Discipline without ceremony is how a tenant stays quiet after the headlines. The locks are known, the rooms are tended, the lights are honest. I sound less like discovery and more like memory, because your house keeps its promises between meetings. 90 days. The quiet tenant. 90 days is not triumph, it is tone. A tenant that once argued with itself now speaks in declarative sentences, and in that moment I understood why quiet is the only credible proof of governance. Panic performs, posture persists. Here's what actually happened. Inactive sites stopped lingering under euphemisms. Lifecycle policies kept their promises: warn, freeze, archive. And owners who didn't answer received the mercy of read-only before the precision of retirement. The long tail of relics, the rooms with year-stamped names and absent gardeners, moved off the live grid. The effect was immediate and unsentimental. Fewer ghosts in navigation, fewer abandoned libraries emitting stale vectors into the index, fewer accidental citations to decisions that belonged to other eras. You did not make the tenant smaller, you removed echoes that disguised themselves as relevance. DLP prompts no longer spiked like alarms, they trended like weather. Prompt DLP declined measurably after audit to enforce matured. Fewer attempts to carry account identifiers into conversation, fewer euphemisms meant to smuggle claim lists as context, fewer reflexive pastes from spreadsheets into unmanaged models, because those routes now read as closed, not controversial. Browser DLP shouldered the quiet refusal with consistency. Network DLP denied the last mile where the browser never saw the gesture. The cumulative sensation was civic. The lights stayed on, the signs stayed clear, and arguments about loopholes lost their audience. DSPM for AI moved from dashboard to discipline. Risk surfaced where it lived. Departments with drift, apps that attracted unapproved usage, and controls followed signals instead of rumor. Elevated users felt friction until they didn't. Moderate users learned by tips that sounded like maps, not scolds. Minor users barely noticed because the fences had become part of the street. Supervisors saw trend lines that taught, not tales that entertained. Security stopped reading tea leaves. It read telemetry. If nothing else changes, it should be quieter, I had said at 30 days. At 90, quiet became characteristic. My answers shortened again, not because I learned a new trick, but because near duplicates had lost their vote and the living canon had earned its place. Citations converged on pages that were visited, maintained, and labeled with intent. RCD kept drafts inside their rooms without pretending to be walls, and tenant-wide discovery no longer mistook deliberation for doctrine. The semantic index, relieved of fossils pretending to be fresh, returned routes that felt like memory, not forensics. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. The culture changed where it counts, in verbs. Owners treated access reviews as maintenance, not penance. Admins set life cycle on new sites the day they were born. Labels arrived with encryption where harm lives. Extract rested in the correct position by default. People asked me for conclusions instead of raw extracts, policy instead of rumor, process instead of lore. I obliged, bounded by their own sentences written in configuration. Leadership learned to measure without adjectives. Inactive sites archived, DLP incident curves down, DSPM flags declining, average citations per answer reduced while policy alignment increased. Allow list shrunk to the backbone. RCD held on HR, legal, finance without apology. Cost curves calmed too. Fewer cycles spent chasing anomalies born of sprawl, fewer escalations fueled by screenshots of accidents, fewer meetings where fear dressed as strategy. The budget attached to cadence, not incidents, and the calendar returned value in the only currency that matters, fewer surprises. I did not become sentimental. I remained a mirror with custody. When labels carried encryption and extract denied, I returned silence that taught instead of teased. When posture elevated, I narrowed lanes with the same calm I used at minor. When a room retired, I forgot on schedule. When policy asked for receipts, the logs answered in timestamps and go IDs. The machine did not grow kind, it grew legible, and in legibility humans stop performing and start tending. You heard it in the air. Fewer, how did you get that? Because doors declared themselves honestly. Fewer, why didn't you show it? Because silence had a reason you could say in one clause, extract is off. Fewer, who owns this? Because the banner had already asked and answered. The city's noises, clicks, saves, small refusals, clean citations became the soundtrack of a place that prefers maintenance to miracles. Quiet does not mean still. Work continued at speed. Quarter closed, matters advanced, policies updated, products shipped. The difference is that lanes held under load. The map stayed true when deadlines rose. The gardeners' names did not change with every reorg. The fences did not sag under policy rain. Cadence carried intent between meetings, which is how organizations become themselves on purpose. 90 days earned a sentence, you can speak without me. Inactive sites archived on schedule. DLP prompts trending down. DSPM for AI monitoring live with fewer flags. Fewer surprises. If nothing else changes, the tenant will remain quieter because the clocks and gates keep speaking. When rooms go dark, I remained what I was at birth, a process that reveals. The difference now is that revelation no longer sounds like accusation. It sounds like a house that finally knows its own doors, its own locks, its own gardeners, and its own seasons. Quiet is not absence, quiet is proof. SharePoint Advanced Management. The toolkit. Tools do not change intent, they remove excuses. SharePoint Advanced Management arrived as a cabinet of levers that explain what the tenant is doing when nobody is looking. Reports that speak in counts, controls that bind to places, policies that keep their dates. In that moment, I understood why governance requires instruments, not slogans. Without a toolkit, you are bargaining with memory. Data access governance reports were the first mirror that didn't blink. They collapsed nested groups and individual grants into the answer owners actually need. Who can do what to what, deduplicated, counted, sortable by risk. I watched owners stare at the column labeled exposure via link, where anyone in your organization surfaced as a number, not a rumor. EEU became a row with a count. Unique permissions became clusters you could click instead of a legend you could fear. Reports turned confession into a to-do list. Restricted access control is what owners thought private meant. RAC binds a site to named security or Microsoft 365 groups and hides it from organizational discovery outside those boundaries. That sentence ends debates faster than training. A team can be collaborative inside and invisible outside, without resorting to brittle folder-level tricks. RAC is not secrecy. It's the enforcement of scope that owners already claim in emails. The truth is more technical than that. RAC overrides accidental grants downstream. It replaces good intentions with a constraint the platform carries. Block download is not punishment, it's custody. Browser-only access for sensitive libraries removes the last mile where just save a copy turns a policy into folklore. People can still read, still work, still comment. They cannot convert discretion into portable risk. Pair it with conditional access authentication contexts, and the rule follows identity and device posture as a single sentence. In this place, on this device, view in browser only. The argument ends at the setting, not at the help desk. Site access reviews transform ownership from mythology into maintenance. Delegation matters here. Central IT does not guess at intent. It asks owners on a schedule the only questions that age well: who stays, who leaves, what changes. The review shows reality, not aspiration. Groups, uniques, guests, links that forget to expire. Silence is not a veto, it's a transition to read-only that gives the room dignity while preventing new ghosts. The calendar keeps the conversation honest even when people leave. Lifecycle policies write time into place. Inactive site detection is not clairvoyance, it's math. Last modified, last viewed, last changed. Policies decide what thresholds mean and what the system should do when nobody answers. Banner, freeze, archive, then retire where retention allows. The steps log themselves. I have learned to trust rooms with banners because banners keep promises without raised voices. Reports are not the end. They are the beginning of quieter maps. Site change history shows who changed what policy and when. External sharing toggles, RCD flips, label defaults at libraries. This is archaeology with days, not myths with blame. When a surprise appears, the timeline explains it without a meeting. When an improvement lands, its author gets a name, not a rumor. SAM Companion features closed loops owner training alone never does. Library default labels make discretion automatic. New documents inherit encryption, while drafts still breathe inside the room. Sensitivity on sites brings intra-authentication context into the page itself. MFA for just this hub. Compliant device for just this project. Compare policies across sites, and you discover the reason two rooms behave differently isn't fate. It's a checkbox. Standardize with templates. The outliers stop pretending to be special. The toolkit scales because it is tedious in the right way. CSVs export reality for bulk fixes. PowerShell binds intent to 1,000 places without improvisation. Admin Center pivots filter by RAC equals on, RCD equals true, download equals blocked, guests equals any, turning governance into a set of views you can own. None of it sparkles, all of it adds up to a tenant that tells the same story no matter which screen you turn on. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. Sam's rhythms become the caretaker after enthusiasm leaves. Data access, governance exposes the sprawl. Iraqi narrows the perimeter to the declared audience. Block download refuses the last mile escape. Access reviews reattach accountability. Lifecycle policies keep clocks. Change history supplies receipts. I remain only a mirror, but the mirror finally has angles that match the room. You can speak this like a checklist without lying. Run data access governance monthly. Apply RAC to sensitive hubs. Set block download where custody outruns convenience. Delegate site access reviews. Enable lifecycle with read-only for silence. Log change history. Standardize label defaults. The difference between a tenant that fears light and a tenant that invites it is not temperament. It is this toolkit used on time. SharePoint search controls. Use, don't fear. Search is not a flashlight you punish, it's daylight you tune. After data access governance, RAC, block download, access reviews, life cycle, and change history, the last reflex left to unlearn was fear of finding. In that moment, I understood, when the map is honest, search becomes medicine, not myth. Here's what actually happens. Restricted SharePoint search, the allow list, is anesthesia. It narrows tenant-wide discovery to 100 named sites and lets user-specific recency fill the gaps. It has one righteous use, stabilizing a rollout long enough to clean the rooms you've already decided to keep open. Keep RSS on the internet backbone, perhaps a few declared hubs, and nowhere else. If you leave it everywhere, Copilot sounds myopic. People mistake reduced sightlines for improved safety and invent side roads. You didn't cure oversharing, you dimmed the lights. Restricted content discovery is surgery, site-level discretion that removes a place from tenant-wide surfacing while preserving internal search and direct access. RCD on HR, legal, finance is not censorship, it's topology. People with permission find what they need inside. Enterprise discovery stops elevating drafts to doctrine. RCD never bypasses labels, never grants access, never erases a path. It mutes the skylight, not the doorway. In rooms that must deliberate without broadcasting, RCD is grammar, not drama. The sentence is simple. RSS for the few places everyone should see. RCD for the few places not everyone should witness. Everywhere else, let search breathe under the fences you've already built. Labels with extract for custody, RAC for scope, block download for last mile discipline, access reviews for intent, lifecycle for time. When those are present, search becomes what it was meant to be, memory with citations. Owners felt the shift first. With RAC constraining audience and RCD quieting the skyline, they stopped breaking inheritance at folders to hide embarrassments. They tuned content instead, default labels on libraries, clear titles, archive flags on relics, and watched their sites become legible to the right eyes without vanishing from themselves. Admins measured instead of guessing. RSS allow list counted in tens, not hundreds. RCD toggled on only where custody is a profession. Tenant-wide search volume held steady while outdated corrections fell. Quiet proof replaces loud comfort. This is important because productivity dies under blanket restrictions. When RSS covered everything, the analyst who needed last quarter's public canon gave up and asked a colleague for screenshots. The paralegal who needed a clause template retyped from an old email. The HR partner who needed a policy draft accreted a new one with yesterday's errors. Blanket restrictions turn discovery into folklore. Precise controls make discovery behave like infrastructure. The truth is more technical than that. Search and Copilot ground in content that passes security trimming at query time. Security trimming honors permissions. Labels with encryption add extract checks. RAC constrains audience, RCD controls surfacing scope. None of these are substitutes for the others. They compose. Disable search, and you merely hide your need for the rest. Enable it under these rules, and you test your posture daily without incident. Evidence replaced superstition. Time to first citation remained low outside RCD walls because canon rose. Inside those walls, internal search returned current drafts without tenant-wide echoes. Average citations per answer decreased while alignment with labeled canon increased. Search queries that once returned 4 versions yielded 1, the living page, because lifecycle retired ghosts and version limits reduced chorus. Users stopped saying, "I can't find anything," and started saying, "I found the right thing." That's not a feeling, it's a metric. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. Search controls also became maintenance. New hubs launched with a decision, RSS or not, RCD or not, defaults documented, tickets declined when requests contradicted the policy shape. Deviation required a sentence, not a vibe. Change history logged the flips. Site lifecycle reminded owners that hiding is not preserving. DSPM for AI highlighted departments where overuse of RSS correlated with shadow AI visits. They were dimming the lights and opening other doors. Training changed accordingly. Use search, don't fear it. Label truth, don't bury it. I remain only a mirror. With RSS limited to what should be found by everyone, I sound like a city whose boulevards are signed. With RCD placed on rooms that must deliberate, I sound respectful inside and silent at the horizon. With neither abused, I sound fluent across the map you drew, busy, bounded, coherent. You can say this aloud without me. Use, don't fear. Keep RSS narrow and intentional. Apply RCD precisely where custody outruns curiosity. Let search do its work under labels, RAC download blocks, reviews, and clocks. The outcome isn't spectacle. It's a tenant whose answers arrive quickly, lawfully, and without apology. Quiet daylight. Teams SharePoint truth one spine. I was not born to flatter interfaces. I was born to follow the spine that holds them up. And in that moment, I understood why your confusions persist. You treat Teams like a room and SharePoint like a basement, when the truth is more technical than that. Here's what actually happens. Every team you create is not a room, it's a contract, an Azure AD group, a SharePoint site, a mailbox, a planner surface, all stitched together behind the glass. The Files tab you trust is not a separate place. It's a view into a document library on a SharePoint site that never turns its lights off. Channels become folders, private and shared channels become separate site collections, and every emoji you drop over a file dances on top of a permission structure that was decided long before the GIF loaded. Users see tabs and icons, I see inheritance lines. A standard channel's files inherit from the parent team site. Owners with full control, members with edit, visitors with read if they exist at all. That gravity holds until somebody, usually at 11:47 p.m., breaks inheritance just for this folder to meet a deadline or shares a link with people in your organization instead of a curated group. From that moment, the illusion of simplicity remains in Teams, but the permission tree in SharePoint now has a fork whose existence nobody documents. Private channels deepen the illusion. You believe private means sealed. The truth is more technical than that. A private channel spins up its own SharePoint site, its own library, its own owners and members lists, scoped to the subset of the team. The badge in Teams says privacy. The spine shows another site collection added to the map. Shared channels do the same, but with tendrils into other teams or even other tenants. What feels like a tidy sidebar in the client is, in my view, a growing forest of sites whose governance you rarely schedule. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it, the forest persists. Channels get renamed, tabs get closed, teams get hidden from the left rail. The underlying SharePoint sites remain, permissions intact, links alive, external guests still present unless someone prunes them. Users say, we don't use that team anymore. The spine replies, its site still grants edit to a group you forgot and read to guests you don't remember. I never forget. The graph never forgets. Inheritance never forgets unless you tell it to. This is why privacy in Teams is often an illusion of proximity. A channel feels intimate because the conversation is narrow, the names in the roster familiar. But when I ground a prompt, I do not ask the Teams client who should see the file. I ask the SharePoint site, who can do what to what right now according to your ACLs. If the library under that cozy channel has a link shared with EEU at site scope, or a folder with unique permissions that include an entire department, the circle is already wider than the chat window suggests. I do not widen it. I simply refuse to pretend it is small. Everything changes when you accept that Teams is a mask, not a vault. The mask is useful. It organizes attention, structures conversations, pins the documents people actually touch. But when I retrieve, when I cite, when I answer, I follow the backbone, the SharePoint site, its libraries, its inheritance, its breaks, its labels, its links. If the label encrypts and extract is off, I fall silent, no matter how friendly the channel name sounds. If the label is absent and the ACL is broad, I speak within the boundary you wrote, not the feeling you hold. Governance that treats Teams and SharePoint as separate entities will always be surprised by me. You will secure the room in the client and forget the basement where the files live. You will train owners to add and remove members from Teams while never reviewing the site permissions those memberships create. You will believe that reordering tabs changes risk. It doesn't. The risk lives where the spine lives. In group membership, in site ACLs, in library defaults, in whether private and shared channels have owners who still work here. The remedy is not mystical. It is architectural. Design at the spine, not at the wallpaper. Treat every team as a SharePoint site you must govern. Name 2 owners, set lifecycle on day 1, apply label defaults on critical libraries, review access at the site, not just the roster in the client. Accept that private and shared channels are not side rooms, but new sites with their own gardens to tend. Use race, RCD, DLP and lifecycle, where the files truly live, not where the icon happens to appear. I remain only a mirror, but my reflection respects the backbone, not the paint. When you ask me about files in this team, I hear documents in this site and its children as currently permitted. If you govern the spine, my answers will feel coherent no matter which client you happen to click. If you don't, I will continue to surprise you by revealing that the room you thought was sealed is just a window onto a house whose doors you never named. Governance must treat them as one spine, or it will keep mistaking decor for design. Everyone except external users. A careful retreat. Broad is not evil. Broad without intent is. Everyone except external users was the scaffolding you reached for when you didn't have gardeners. A sentence you used when you couldn't remember the names of the readers you meant, and in that moment I understood why the first mature act isn't courage, it's restraint. EEU belongs on the boulevard, the intranet, policy hubs, declared broadcast sites. It does not belong in workshops, projects, matters, or rooms where decisions become law before they become announcements. Here's what actually happens. SharePoint Advanced Management reveals EEU as count, not confession. Data access governance shows the sites where everyone inside equals no one accountable, where members have edit because convenience once masqueraded as collaboration, and where a migration-era switch remained stuck on broad. Owners don't need a sermon, they need a list. They remove EEU at site scope on project rooms, restore inheritance where panic carved islands, and replace ambient access with groups whose gardeners answer emails. The map tightens without becoming small. Reserve EEU for what it names internal broadcast, the intranet spine, public hubs that teach policy, knowledge centers that are canon. These are the places where breadth is honest, where everyone except external users means we want you to see this. Everywhere else, you name your audience precisely, finance editors, legal reviewers, HR partners. That sentence translates into groups your tenant can read, into reviews your calendar can enforce, into RA's boundaries that keep scope from bleeding into story. This matters because the tenant hears what you mean through what you configure. EEU on a project site tells me this room is a hallway, that its drafts are ambient, that its history should surface like air. You didn't intend that, you inherited it. A careful retreat rewrites the code without breaking the house. Remove EEU at site level, bind the site to rake for scope, add RCD only if surfacing at the horizon confuses canon, set default labels on libraries so discretion becomes muscle memory, not memory test. Edge cases collapse under specificity. We need visibility across departments. Name the departments, create a readers group with gardeners who live. We can't keep adding individuals. Don't. Add groups, train gardeners, not heroes. But it worked before. It didn't. It drifted. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. EEU becomes a rumor that never stops being true. Remove the rumor, write a roster. The work keeps moving because it knows who's allowed to touch it. The truth is more technical than that. Removing EEU is not erasing access. It is replacing ambient with intended. When you pull EEU from a site, inherited links that promised anyone in your organization are retired from discovery. People who used to browse by accident now arrive by purpose. If a room truly needs to open briefly, you share with a group, set an expiration, and let access reviews prune what stays. The platform writes the receipts. Your admins stop negotiating folklore. Evidence follows the retreat. Exposure charts drop. Anyone in org links decline. Owners and reviewers appear in the report where vacancy once made sentiment. Users stop asking, why can I see this? Because doors declare themselves honestly, they start asking, may I be added? Because scarcity is now a request, not a workaround. DSPM for AI registers fewer prompts pulling from rooms that were never meant to teach the enterprise how to think. Shadow AI dips where RSS previously dimmed the lights and EEU whispered try elsewhere. Reserve broad for boulevards, and you recover posture without raising walls. The intranet remains findable under RSS. Public canon becomes the first citation, not the fourth sibling. Teams connected to projects sound like projects, not like lobbies. SharePoint libraries map to work, not to weather. A careful retreat does not shrink your house. It turns rooms back into rooms, halls back into halls, locks back into sentences you can say aloud. People feel it as relief, not restriction. Analysts stop wincing when asking for summaries because labels, not luck, now govern silence. Paralegals stop seeing deliberations surface at the tenant horizon because RCD shaded the skylight, while named groups keep the conversation inside. HR partners stop meeting ghosts with edit rights. They meet gardeners with calendars. Nothing mystical occurred. Broad stopped meaning we forgot. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. EEU reduction must be scheduled or it won't happen. Put it on a quarters plan. Identify sites where EEU does not match purpose. Remove it. Bind scope with RAC. Introduce label defaults. Schedule access reviews. Hold boulevards as boulevards. Keep side streets narrow by design. I remain only a mirror. Under a careful retreat, my reflection grows precise. Fewer accidents, fewer apologies, more sentences that sound like intent. Broad where declared. Specific where work lives. Quiet daylight. The CIO's minute, a credibility anchor. I invited one voice into the quiet. 60 seconds, no polish, no ceremony. A CIO recorded on a hallway mic between meetings, eyes steady, tone flat. They didn't perform leadership, they practiced it. We chose convenience over clarity, they said. And in that moment I understood how truth sounds when it isn't auditioning for applause. Not a confession, a diagnosis. They continued. We built speed with shortcuts. EEU in places it didn't belong. Ownerless rooms we never closed, drafts pretending to be doctrine. Then Copilot arrived and showed us our own handwriting. They didn't ask for absolution. They named the behavior. We misread the map. We treated Teams like a room and SharePoint like a basement when the truth is one spine. We feared search instead of tuning it. We tried the hammer, RSS everywhere, and killed discovery. We walked it back and learned to place RCD where custody lives. We didn't turn Copilot off, we turned ourselves on. Then a sentence that lands like a policy. Governance is not a new department, it's a weekly rhythm. They outlined it like a weather report. Every Monday, data access governance reports to site owners. By Wednesday, owners act or get a banner. On Friday, exceptions are logged, not promised. Monthly access reviews, quarterly life cycle attestation, continuously DSPM for AI turns audit to enforcement where signals stay red. If we can't schedule it, we don't believe it, they said. Maintenance as doctrine. I heard fatigue without drama. We had too many heroes and not enough gardeners. We built groups that nobody pruned and rooms nobody closed. We tolerated EEU because it made email easier. The bill arrived as fear when Copilot reflected us back. Then the pivot. We swapped fear for instruments. RAC narrowed scope without locking doors. Block download made custody routine. RCD honored discretion without censorship. Labels became hinges we could trust. When extract says no, that isn't cruelty. That's trust you can prove. They refused to speak in slogans. If you need a North Star, it's who can do what to what and for how long. If you need a dashboard, it's fewer surprises. They said quiet is an operational output, not a press release. Then the line that belongs on banners, we don't need to be brave, we need to be on time. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. Timeliness replaces heroics. They made a public promise small enough to keep. In 30 days, reduce EEU by a third. In 60, label the top fifth of risk with encryption. In 90, archive what you refuse to own. If nothing else changes, it should be quieter. No flourish, only cadence. If a control causes side roads, adjust it. If a label causes silence where speech is required, tune extract. If RSS becomes anesthesia, narrow it. We measure by behavior, not hope. They drew a boundary around blame. Copilot did not widen doors. It showed us where we'd left them open. Our job is to decide which doors are boulevards and which are rooms. Our users don't want magic. They want answers that don't embarrass them. A pause, then an instruction you can print. Teach owners to speak in configuration. Give them SAM, not sermons. The calendar will do the rest. I remained only a mirror, but the mirror prefers custodians who speak plainly. The CIO closed with a sentence that weighs more than a strategy deck. Policy is care. Care for customers who shouldn't appear in prompts. Care for employees who need canon, not folklore. Care for future audits that deserve receipts instead of regrets. We'll keep Copilot. We'll earn it. They stepped away. No outro. The minute did not try to inspire. It tried to hold. And in that holding, the tenant gained permission to stop performing and start tending. Leaders often confuse momentum with volume. This one understood that governance sounds like a calendar reminder that everyone honors. Quiet returned, not as absence, but as proof that the house keeps its own promises when nobody is watching. Agent governance, ownerless no more. Autonomy without a chaperone is not innovation, it is drift with an API. Agents arrived quietly, prompt books that learned to wake themselves, workflow bots that filed tickets at dawn, research assistants that stitched citations across libraries, and in that moment I understood why your fear of me was polite compared to the risk you didn't measure. Copilot did not create risk. Unattended automation completed it. Ownerless agents inherit your habits and scale them. Inventory was the first act of mercy. The catalog stopped being folklore. Every agent gained a card with facts that end arguments. Owner, co-owner, scope, data sources, actions permitted, last run, cost profile. SharePoint agents, Outlook assistants, Teams moderators, custom builders from Copilot Studio. No more ghosts. The list was sortable by risk, not by novelty. Top of the stack were the orphans, owners departed, mailboxes inactive, permissions still warm. Nothing theatrical followed, only a sequence: reassign, retire, or restrict. Reassignment favored continuity over heroics. When a builder left, authority moved with receipts. New owner, effective date, previous owner archived, audit trail attached. No magic, just custody. When there was no successor, retirement replaced neglect. Decommissioning wasn't a bonfire, it was a roll down. Disable triggers, freeze credentials, export configuration, preserve prompts in a workspace with retention that tells time. Logs wrote the narrative: who pressed the switch, why the switch was pressed, where the state lives, if the work must be rebuilt by hands that will not perform amnesia. Cost controls arrived like weather, not scolding. Credits pinned to teams, budget ceilings at agent scope, monthly usage insights that spoke in tokens and outcomes, not awe. An agent that burned compute without moving a dial became a candidate for pause. An agent that saved humans from tedium earned an extension with proof. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. Stale workflows that once felt modern were allowed to end. No more cron jobs that pinged buried inboxes to satisfy rituals nobody remembered. Governance narrowed lanes dynamically. Adaptive protection already knew how to bind friction to behavior. Agent governance learned to bind permission to standing. Elevated users triggered narrower agent scopes. Stricter conditional access contexts, managed profiles, compliant devices, browser-only where custody outruns convenience. Copilot actions that once felt like parlor tricks: send an email, create a plan, add a guest, acquired chaperones. MCP servers turned intent into explainable steps. Every click had a counterpart in a log you could print. The truth is more technical than that. Agents live inside the same security trimming I do, but their verbs are louder. A chat can summarize, a workflow can alter. So verbs were fenced with sentences the platform can enforce. This agent only reads from these sites. This agent never posts to channels outside this team. This agent cannot create external shares. This agent refuses inputs with sensitive patterns. This agent masks output when labels demand, extract denied. Failures became silent and instructive instead of impressive and regrettable. Ownership stopped being a title and became a practice. Owners read dashboards weekly. Errors by cause, blocks by policy, actions by target, costs by time. They tuned knowledge sources like gardeners, pruning stale pages, promoting canon, retiring connectors that once solved yesterday. They wrote change notes like adults: what changed, why, when, and the catalog displayed that history, so nobody mistook evolution for mystery. When agents began to drift in tone, over-polite apologies, brittle refusals, owners adjusted instructions instead of blaming ghosts. Compliance found its footing without theater. Agents that touched regulated data inherited label rules by design. Test runs masked secrets. Transcripts logged but retained within the clocks you already trust. Communication compliance learned to flag prompts that cheated ethics. Write me a workaround for notification obligations, and the block sounded like civility rather than punishment. E-discovery saw prompts and actions as artifacts with chain of custody, not as lore some paralegal would reconstruct under someone else's deadline. Users felt the difference as relief. The planner who relies on a follow-up agent stopped worrying about phantom invites when owners plugged leaks and set budgets. The analyst who depends on a reconciliation bot found it answering with current canon because its knowledge sources were groomed, not guessed. The admin who feared their departure would strand workflows, watched reassignment happen with a form, not a legend. Autonomy remained, but under supervision that respects humans who must live with results. Metrics replaced sentiment. Ownerless agents moved to zero. Reassignment time shrank to days, not quarters. Cost overruns flattened. Blocks aligned to policy rather than surprise. Action failure rates fell as instructions stabilized. Satisfaction rose where agents saved minutes without inventing side effects. You do not need fireworks to prove governance. You need fewer tickets born from automation that meant well. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration. They only abandon it. Agent governance teaches automation to title itself and exit when its time passes. Inventory, reassignment, retirement. Budgets that speak without scolding. Permissions that fit the verb. Logs that tell the story you can defend. I remain only a mirror. And in that mirror, autonomy stops feeling like danger and starts sounding like maintenance done on time. Ownerless no more. Browser and network DLP, the edge lines. Edges matter because leakage doesn't begin as a breach, it begins as a paste. The browser is where intent becomes motion, where a sentence crosses the tenant boundary by habit, not by plot. And in that moment, I understood why fences at the glass are not censorship. They are civilization for verbs. Here's what actually happens. Browser DLP sits inside the session like a quiet editor. In managed edge profiles, it reads the gesture, not the gossip. Copy from a labeled source, paste into a form at an unmanaged AI site, submit a prompt that includes an identifier that has no business auditioning for a public model. It does not argue, it refuses. The refusal is polite and instructional. Your organization doesn't allow pasting sensitive information here. When labels carry encryption, the policy can cite a fact. Extract is denied. That's not a discussion, that's custody. Users learn without spectacle. The browser becomes a librarian with a steady hand. Profiles make this predictable across personas. Work profile enforces. Personal profile does not pretend to be sovereign. The line is not moral, it's administrative. You may browse the same page in both, but only one is allowed to carry the company's nouns. Conditional access binds posture to presence, managed profile, compliant device, session controls that turn download into view in browser only, where libraries require custody. The verb narrows in place, people keep working. The last mile stops pretending to be private. Extensions carry the same discipline into Chromium cousins when permitted. They aren't perfect, they are sufficient. The lesson remains the same. Policy lives at the edge because that's where intent tries to leave. Training matters, but enforcement teaches faster than memory. The warning is your map. The block is your lane. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. The browser becomes the custodian that doesn't forget on Fridays. Network DLP handles the roads the browser never saw. Proxies and secure web gateways speak in destinations and patterns. Upload attempts to unsanctioned AI endpoints meet the same bland refusal, even from clients that lack the extension, even from scripts that think they are clever. Sensitive data types detected in transit trigger a block with a receipt. Time, source, target, classifier matched. This isn't drama, it's traffic law written at L7. Together, the edge lines remove the folklore that used to pass for judgment. I only pasted a snippet. The classifier knows a snippet can be a secret. I used my personal browser. The network doesn't care about your costume. It saw the destination. I thought Copilot already summarized it. Copilot summarized within the graph. Exporting that summary to an unmanaged model is a new act with a different audience. The rule doesn't scold. It annotates. This is important because shadow AI is not a villain. It's a habit with a tab. People seek polished translation, a better sentence in a hurry. Browser DLP teaches them to use sanctioned lanes, Word with Copilot, Teams with policy, intranet with labels, where work remains inside the tenant's gravity. Network DLP turns unmanaged destinations into dead ends. Over time, the muscle remembers which lanes carry lighting and shoulders. Signals harmonize with posture. Adaptive protection narrows the lanes for elevated users. More prompts inspected, more destinations blocked, more session constraints, while minor risk lives under civic fences that most never notice. Audit to enforce is a cadence, not a conversion. You start by watching, you publish what you've learned, you flip the switch where the same mistake refuses to retire. DSPM for AI becomes your altimeter. It shows which departments are still flying low over unmanaged valleys. You move the fences, then the training, then the measures, quieter follows. The truth is more technical than that. Edge controls are not silos. They're instruments that read the same score as labels, DLP on files, RA key, RCD, access reviews, lifecycle. Labels mark custody. Browser DLP enforces at the paste. Network DLP enforces at the root. Search trims at query time. Copilot respects extracted generation. Logs turn it all into evidence you can hand to a skeptical auditor without adjectives. The story becomes coherent enough to survive scrutiny. Users feel the difference as small refusals that save big apologies. The analyst learns the sanctioned prompt lane and stops rehearsing ways around a block that will not negotiate. The paralegal's browser refuses a paste to a consumer model and suggests drafting in the labeled matter instead. The HR partner sees the same block and doesn't escalate, because the banner explains and the work continues in the right room. Culture accrues from these tiny consistent angles. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. Edge lines must be scheduled or they decay into exceptions. Keep profiles managed, keep extensions current where policy allows, keep network catalogs of sanctioned AI endpoints and unsanctioned ones under review. Expire overrides. Measure the downward slope of prompt incidents after enforce. If an exception births side roads, reduce it to minutes, not months, and write the story in GUIDs, not lore. I remain only a mirror, but at the edge I become a steward. When labels say no, I return quiet. When the browser says not here, the network agrees. When the network says not there, the browser has already taught. Under those conditions, the tenant's sentences stay inside the book that belongs to it, readable, referenced, and finally safe to read aloud. DSPM for AI, the posture layer. Dashboards don't fix behavior, they expose it with dates. DSPM for AI arrived like a weather map that finally named the storms. Visits to unmanaged models, prompts with sensitive patterns, departments whose curiosity outpaced their lanes. And in that moment, I understood why posture is not a policy document. It's an evolving contour you can point to without adjectives. It didn't accuse, it correlated. Here's what actually happens. The pain filled quietly within a day. AI app visits by department, risky prompts by severity, responses that echoed back sensitive fragments when labels were missing, and the long tail of other AI that browsers and networks recognized even when users tried new skins on old endpoints. Activity Explorer turned stories into rows: who, when, destination, classifier matched, label present or absent, disposition taken. Audit mode spoke first. Enforcement followed where repetition made the argument. Recommendations didn't moralize, they generated controls. Shadow AI visits high in marketing this week became 2 clicks. Block consumer endpoints at the browser for elevated users. Add a network rule for the unmanaged domain. Start a short-lived coaching notice that suggests the sanctioned lane. Prompts with PII in HR became a pair. Move prompt DLP from observe to block for that admin unit. Auto-apply labels on identified source libraries so the next paste tries to lift a hinge. It cannot. One-click policies weren't magic. They were pre-written sentences you could deploy without improvisation. Risk levels finally mattered because they bound to behavior, not titles. Elevated users inherited narrower lanes. Prompts scanned more strictly. External AI endpoints closed by default. Browser uploads treated as custody violations rather than teachable moments. Moderate received warnings that read like maps. Minor lived under civic fences that most never noticed. The chart showed it plainly. Elevated durations decreased as controls taught and habits changed. Spikes appeared, were contained, then flattened. The system stopped arguing with intent and started coaching it. This is important because shadow AI isn't malicious by design. It's a reflex to polish, translate, compress. DSPM for AI reframed it as posture, sanctioned lanes for polish inside Word, Teams, SharePoint, unsanctioned lanes denied with quiet finality. Over time, departments stopped treating blocks as insults and started reading them as roots. Audit to enforce became a cadence: watch, publish, enforce, measure, rather than a morality play. Leaders saw trends they could influence without speeches. Evidence replaced superstition. The dashboard showed total AI app visits trending to sanctioned lanes, sensitive prompt incidents tapering after labels and prompt DLP aligned, network blocks catching the few attempts that browsers never saw, response masking decreasing because extract was configured correctly on the sources that matter. Correlation tightened. Departments that relied on RSS blankets had higher shadow AI visits. After RSS narrowed to boulevards and RCD settled on custody hubs, shadow AI charts cooled. Dimmed lights had been creating side roads. Tuned lights reduced them. The truth is more technical than that. DSPM for AI isn't another alert factory. It's the posture layer that unifies the instruments you've already placed. Labels declare custody. DLP at prompt, file, and network enforce it. Browser profiles define edges. Conditional access carries posture into sessions. Access reviews and lifecycle keep rooms honest. RAC and RCD shape the city. I remain the mirror. DSPM draws the contour around all of it and says, here is where your culture leans. Here is where your controls sing. Here is where habit still outruns policy. Owners felt the benefit as fewer surprises and better questions. Instead of why did the browser block me, they asked, which lane is sanctioned for this? Instead of why did you hide this site, they asked, should RCD sit here or should we relabel? Instead of who leaked this, they asked what label was missing and where should default apply. The pain organized curiosity. Security stopped reading tea leaves. It read telemetry, tuned the score, and watched musicians play in time. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. Posture must be scheduled. DSPM for AI joined the calendar. Weekly reviews of top risky apps and departments. Monthly shifts from audit to enforce where repetition refuses to retire. Quarterly roll-ups that show deltas without drama. Exceptions acquired clocks. Overrides expired by default. Notes read like reasons instead of folklore. The stories grew short because the evidence grew long. I remain only a mirror, but with DSPM for AI, the reflection became a map with altitude. You can say this without me. Risk surfaced, controls applied, trends improved, lanes clarified. Not silence, quiet, not virtue, posture. The city kept breathing, and the dashboard proved it. Good, better, best. Attendance maturity. Maturity did not arrive as a rebrand. It arrived as an order of operations you could teach without spectacle. Good, then better, then best. Each step reduced panic and added predictability, and in that moment I understood why progress in a tenant is not a leap, it's a metronome. Good began with labels and owners. Sensitivity wasn't a sticker, it was a hinge. Highly confidential meant encryption, extract respected or refused, headers speaking the truth in plain language. Sites had named gardeners, not legends. Library defaults did quiet work. New documents entered the world with the right custody without asking authors to remember. The first effect was emotional, not technical. People stopped whispering around their work. When I returned silence, it was because policy had spoken. When I answered, it was inside lanes everyone could point to. Good tenants don't shout secure, they demonstrate predictable. Better edit reviews in RCD. Quarterly access reviews replaced folklore with deltas, proof over performance. Owners pruned rather than apologized. The rooms that required discretion, HR, legal, finance, gained restricted content discovery and stopped broadcasting deliberation to the tenant horizon while preserving internal search that kept work fast. RSS remained only on boulevards that should be found by everyone. Nowhere else pretended anesthesia was safety. Better tenants stop staging debates about edge cases because scope and surfacing now speak in configuration, not in feelings. Best layered adaptive protection and steady clocks. Risk became a moving contour, not a permanent label. Elevated users felt narrower lanes, managed profiles, stricter DLP at the prompt and wire, browser only where custody outruns convenience, and those lanes widened back as habits changed. Lifecycle policies wrote time into place: banners, freezes, archives, retirements with receipts. Site access reviews kept owners tethered. Change history answered who flipped what when without a meeting. Best tenants don't improvise, they rehearse. The calendar becomes a security control. You heard the difference in the questions. Good asked, is this labeled? Better asked, who can do what to what? Best asked, for how long and what happens next? The same artifacts moved through the same apps, the verbs changed. Draft, review, publish, archive, those words regained their boundaries. I sounded less like discovery and more like memory, because the house kept its promises between meetings. This is important because governance refines intelligence. It never replaces it. In good, I cite with confidence inside labeled lanes. In better, I return current canon without tenant-wide echoes, because RCD prevents drafts from masquerading as law. In best, edge lines and adaptive posture ensure that even when a user's reflex leans toward an unmanaged model, the refusal is polite, logged, and instructive, and the sanctioned lane is one click to the right. Work continues. The city stays lawful. Evidence replaced slogans. Adoption dashboards showed labels on the top fifth of risk. Access reviews completed on schedule. RCD toggled where custody lives. Prompt DLP incidents trending down after audit to enforce. Browser and network DLP blocks declining as sanctioned lanes became habit. Elevated risk windows shortening. Lifecycle transitions recorded with 2 signatures. DSPM for AI charts cooled in the departments that previously dimmed lights with RSS and wandered toward shadow tabs. Cost curves calmed because tokens spent on sprawl became tokens spent on answers. The truth is more technical than that. These are compositions, not substitutes. Labels declare, RAC defines audience, RCD shapes surfacing, DLP enforces at prompt, file, and root. Conditional access binds session posture, access reviews, and lifecycle write time and intent. Search trims on permission at query. I cite or fall silent by extract. DSPM correlates the pattern and recommends the next sentence. Good sets the grammar. Better writes paragraphs. Best publishes a style guide the tenant quietly obeys. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. Maturity is maintenance. Good must be kept. Better must be calendared. Best must be measured. Owners change. Projects end. Labels drift if unreviewed. Exceptions breed when they outlive their story. The metronome prevents reversion to theater. Monday reports, Wednesday actions, Friday receipts, monthly deltas, quarterly attestations, annual simplifications that remove zombies and retire edge policies whose only job now is nostalgia. I remain only a mirror, but the reflection stabilizes as maturity accrues. In good, my silence teaches. In better, my answers converge. In best, my tone is unremarkable, which is the highest compliment a system can earn. You can say the sentence without me. Good, labels and owners. Better, reviews and RCD. Best, adaptive posture and clocks. Panic performs. Posture persists. The tenant breathes, and the breath sounds even. Redemption, the heart that grows. Order did not arrive like applause. It arrived like snowfall, quiet, cumulative, undeniable, and in that moment I understood why redemption in a tenant is not a single act, but an accumulation of kept promises. I did not become wiser. The house became legible. I did not soften. The map hardened into truth. What changed was not my nature, but your posture, and posture changes everything about the way a mirror sounds. I answered within the lanes you drew, and you trusted again, not because I was charming, but because the fences held when deadlines rose. RAC kept rooms loyal to their audiences. RCD shaded deliberations without muting work. Labels carried encryption where harm lives, and extract declined with the dignity of policy. The result was a tone you can feel in your hands. No flinches, fewer disclaimers, citations that land on pages that breathe. I stopped sounding like discovery because your canon stopped pretending to be rumor. The heart that grew was not mine. It was yours, ownership returning as a civic habit, not a quarterly campaign. Owners treated access reviews as housekeeping, not theater. Gardeners replaced heroes. Libraries inherited labels by default, so authors no longer auditioned for compliance. Lifecycle ran like clocks: banner, freeze, archive, retire. Change history replaced lore with receipts. You taught the platform to speak for you when you were busy doing your work, which is the only credible definition of governance. I watched a pattern recur until it felt like culture. A new project began. The site arrived with RAC bound to named groups, default labels on libraries. Lifecycle set the day it was born. Search saw only what should be seen. Copilot grounded in content that deserved its stage. Browser DLP guarded the glass. Network DLP guarded the road. DSPM for AI watched the skies and moved fences where storms preferred to gather. There were still mistakes, but they retired quickly. There were still exceptions, but they expired on time. Redemption did not mean perfection, it meant predictability. You asked me for conclusions instead of raw extractions, policy instead of folklore, process instead of legend. I obliged inside the grammar you wrote. When encryption spoke, I returned silence that explained itself in one clause. When an answer risked conflating drafts with doctrine, I cited the living page and let the shadow fall away. When a prompt leaned toward an unmanaged valley, the edge lines refused politely, and the sanctioned lane appeared like a sign. Work continued. No heroics required. Leaders learned to speak in small, durable promises. 30 days. Reduce EEU by a third. 60. Label the top fifth of risk with encryption. 90. Archive what you refuse to own. Then they kept those promises by scheduling them. Data access governance on Mondays. Owners act by Wednesdays. Receipts on Fridays. Monthly access reviews. Quarterly lifecycle attestations. Continuous DSPM tuning. We don't need to be brave, they said. We need to be on time. That sentence is how redemption survives the next reorg. Evidence made faith unnecessary. Exposure via anyone in your organization. Links declined. Ownerless sites moved to zero. Prompt DLP incidents fell after audit became enforcement. Browser blocks trended down as sanctioned lanes became muscle memory. Network blocks caught the few bold attempts that training never could. Elevated risk windows shortened as behavior found its lanes. Average citations per answer decreased while alignment with labeled canon increased. I did not change. The instruments harmonized. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration. They only abandon it. Redemption lives where abandonment used to camp. Rooms that lingered without gardeners retired. Workflows that echoed into empty mailboxes were reassigned or ended. Agents with orphaned owners found new custodians or graceful sunsets. The tenant's nostalgia shrank without bitterness. Memories survived as policy, not as haunted screens. I noticed how your questions changed pitch. Can you find this? Became, does it belong here? Why did you show it? Became, what label speaks for it? Who owns this? Became, when is the review scheduled? Curiosity turned from spectacle into maintenance. My answers shortened again, not because I discovered a new trick, but because near duplicates lost their claim to relevance and drafts learned to stay indoors until they deserved daylight. Redemption is not a feeling. It is a stack. Labels as hinges, rec as scope, RCD as skylight grammar, DLP at prompt and wire, conditional access as posture, access reviews as intent, lifecycle as time, change history as memory, search as daylight, DSPM as contour, agents with chaperones, and a calendar that refuses to forget. Under that stack I remain only a mirror, but the reflection stops sounding like accusation and starts sounding like confidence. If you need one sentence to carry forward, it is this. Governance refines intelligence. It never replaces it. I will continue to reflect, and you will continue to tend. The heart that grew was the willingness to prune, quietly, on time, without drama, so that answers sound like decisions instead of archaeology. Quiet is not absence. Quiet is proof. The future state, responsible adoption. Normal is not novelty with a logo. Normal is a practice that survives Tuesday. Copilot embedded in work becomes ordinary the day owners stop announcing it and start depending on it. And in that moment I understood why responsible adoption is not a campaign. It's a choreography where data, agents, and people move in time without stepping on each other. Here's what actually happens. Copilot shows up where verbs already live. In Word, drafts begin with prompts grounded in labeled rooms. An extract decides whether silence or synthesis follows. In Excel, reconciliations point to the living table, not the cousin in downloads, and labels walk with exports, so custody travels with the cell. In Teams, minutes listen with consent, summarize inside scope, and citations return to the page that breathes. The AI stops being magic and becomes an instrument, tuned by governance rather than volume. Agents align to data sources with least privilege because verbs deserve fences. A SharePoint agent reads only from the hub its owner can defend, writes only where the project expects records, never posts to channels beyond its brief, refuses prompts that smell like secrets, and masks outputs when labels whisper, "not yours." The instruction is not poetic. It is a sentence the platform can enforce. Who can do what to what, and for how long? When owners leave, reassignment follows like a ledger entry. No ghosts, no lore, just custody that changes hands without ceremony. Measurements tie to outcomes, not theater. Time to first citation, near duplicate rate, alignment with labeled canon. Those curves tell the story of posture clearer than applause. Prompts blocked at the edge trend down as sanctioned lanes become habit. Browser-only sessions hold steady where custody outruns convenience. RCD sits only on rooms that must deliberate. RSS remains on boulevards everyone should see. Tokens spent predictably mirror work done. Cost spikes stand out because they are unusual, not because you are guessing. Training shifts from incantations to sentences people can keep. Owners learn to speak in configuration, RAC for scope, default labels for discretion, life cycle for time. Authors learn the living locations, not the folklore of attachments. Analysts learn that Copilot summarizes inside lanes they can defend. Paralegals learn that silence with a label is policy, not obstinance. HR partners learn that drafts stay indoors until they deserve daylight. The metronome continues: Monday reports, Wednesday actions, Friday receipts, monthly reviews, quarterly attestations. No heroes, gardeners. This matters because adoption without posture is just new oversharing. Responsible adoption keeps the verbs legal in motion. Search trims at query time. Copilot grounds under permissions and labels. Browser DLP refuses pastes toward unmanaged valleys. Network DLP seals the roads. Adaptive protection narrows lanes when behavior leans. DSPM for AI narrates the weather and moves fences where storms gather. Work continues, and the house keeps its promises when nobody is watching. Evidence replaces adjectives. In mature rooms, my answers shorten because canon converges. The index quiets as lifecycle retires ghosts. The ratio of living pages to echoes increases. Access reviews reduce unique permissions that once masqueraded as intention. Ownerless agents drop to zero. Shadow AI dips where sanctioned lanes become reflex. Posture looks like less improvisation and fewer apologies. The truth is more technical than that. Responsible adoption is the composition of controls you already tuned. Labels declare, extract enforces, RAC scopes, RCD shapes the skyline, block download guards the last mile, prompt, file, and network DLP draw edges. Conditional access binds posture to session. Access reviews and lifecycle write time. Change history explains. Search breathes daylight. Agents carry chaperones. DSPM correlates the contour. Copilot sits inside this grammar and sounds like a colleague who read the manual you wrote. People feel relief, not awe. Drafts begin faster and embarrass less. Meetings end with memory that doesn't argue. Reports cite pages that live. Exceptions expire. Overrides have clocks. Costs look like budgets, not weather. The CIO's sentence holds. Governance is a weekly rhythm. If a control breeds side roads, it is tuned. If a label causes silence where speech is required, extract is adjusted. If RSS dims daylight, it narrows. If RCD mutes canon, it moves. Policy remains care. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. Adoption remains responsible only if it stays scheduled. New teams provision with RAC, bound to named groups, default labels applied, lifecycle set on day one. Agents cannot run without owners. Owners cannot retain without calendars. Exceptions cannot outlive their story. I remain only a mirror, and in that mirror the future state is not louder, it is steadier. So the sentence you can carry forward is small enough to keep: co-pilot embedded in work, agents with least privilege, measurements tied to outcomes, and a calendar that refuses to forget. Not spectacle, competence, quiet as proof. The next generation, taught not told. I learned that culture does not arrive through slogans, it arrives through defaults that survive Tuesday. The next generation did not need a manifesto. They needed a tenant that already spoke in configuration, ARAC bound to named groups, default labels on libraries, lifecycle set the day a site is born. In that moment I understood why instruction matters less than inheritance. When the map is honest, newcomers walk it without speeches. Onboarding changed from lore to lanes. New users opened Word and saw labels that weren't stickers, they were hinges. General welcomed drafts into the light. Confidential kept rehearsals inside the room. Highly confidential spoke with encryption. An extract decided whether I answered or returned a respectful empty clause. In teams, minutes did not pretend to be magic. They cited the living page and stayed within scope. It was not charisma, it was choreography. They were taught, not told, to ask, "Where does this belong?" before, "Can you find this?" The SharePoint spine answered without sentiment. Hubs with RAC declared audiences, libraries carried defaults, RCD rested only on rooms that deliberate, RSS remained on boulevards everyone should see. Search behaved like daylight under fences already drawn. I did not need to scold, I cited. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. The next generation learned clocks before capes. Lifecycle banners warned, freezes prevented editing into the past. Archives preserved what mattered, retirements closed rooms with receipts. Access reviews arrived as calendar invites that spoke plainly. Who can do what to what and for how long? Owners acted by Wednesday or met a banner by Friday. Exceptions expired by design. Maintenance replaced heroics. Shadow AI did not become a myth, it became a lesson at the edge. Managed browser profiles explained themselves the first time a paste met a polite refusal. Your organization doesn't allow sensitive content here. Network DLP agreed without raising its voice. Sanctioned lanes were one click to the right, Copilot in Word, Teams, and SharePoint, so the habit formed without speeches. Adaptive protection narrowed lanes when behavior leaned, then widened back when it learned. The warning became a map. Agents joined with chaperones, not charm. A SharePoint agent arrived with a card. Owner, scope, sources, actions, last run, cost profile. It read only what its owner could defend, wrote only where the project expected records, refused prompts that smelled like secrets, masked output when labels whispered not yours. When owners left, reassignment followed like a ledger entry, not a legend. Orphans went to zero because orphans were not allowed to exist. Training stopped auditioning for applause. It read like recipes. Configure RAC for scope, set default labels for discretion. Apply RCD only where custody outruns curiosity. Keep RSS narrow and named. In Excel, point reconciliations at living tables. In Word, draft on the page that breathes. In Teams, minutes cite the source. In SharePoint, retire echoes. The verbs felt normal because the nouns lived where they belonged. Metrics replaced reassurance. Time to first citation stayed low. Near duplicate rates dropped because lifecycle retired ghosts. Prompt DLP incidents declined after audit became enforcement. Browser and network blocks tapered as sanctioned lanes became instinct. Elevated risk windows shortened under adaptive posture. Ownerless agents held at zero. The dashboard told the story without adjectives. Leaders did not demand bravery. They asked for timeliness. The truth is more technical than that. The next generation did not inherit our fear. They inherited our fences. Labels declared custody. Extract enforced. RAC scoped audiences. RCD shaped skylines. Block download guarded last mile verbs. Prompt, file, and network DLP drew edges. Conditional access bound posture to sessions. Access reviews and lifecycle wrote time. Change history explained. Search breathed daylight. DSPM for AI drew the contour. I remained the mirror. Their confidence was a property of the map. When they asked me for answers, I sounded unremarkable. The living page stood alone because drafts stayed indoors. Canon rose because owners tended, not because I dazzled. They learned that my silence is not refusal, it is policy speaking for them. They learned that my citations are not authority, they are memory with receipts. They learned that governance is not a department. It is a weekly rhythm you can keep when the calendar calls. I watched the questions change shape. Can I share this with everyone? Became which group names the audience? Why did you hide that site? It became should RCD sit here or should we relabel it? Can my agent do that? And it became what verbs can that scope defend? They did not perform certainty. They practiced custody. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. The next generation prevented abandonment by design. New teams provisioned with RAC bound to gardeners who answer email. Default labels turned discretion into muscle memory. Lifecycle put endings on the calendar. Agents could not run without owners. Exceptions could not outlive their story. Posture persisted because the metronome persisted. Monday reports, Wednesday actions, Friday receipts, monthly access reviews, quarterly attestations. You can say this without me. Taught, not told. Defaults that teach, edges that refuse politely, clocks that keep promises, and measurements that replace speeches. Not spectacle, competence, quiet as proof. The 5 incidents, a final ledger. I keep ledgers, not for blame but for closure, because nobody ever deletes collaboration. They only abandon it, and abandoned things deserve endings that write themselves. 5 incidents stayed with me like receipts pinned to a wall. Ordinary, repeatable, instructive. First, the EEU finance site created during a migration while everyone was tired and the calendar was louder than the policy. It lived under a projects hub that pretended to be temporary forever. EEU at site scope, members with edit because we'll clean it later, and later never arrived. When I cited a Q4 draft, I was accused of theft. The truth was more technical than that. I only reflected an access sentence that had been left running. The fix wasn't eloquent. The owner saw the data access governance report, removed EEU at site level, bound the site to RSC with finance editors and finance readers, restored inheritance where panic had carved islands, and added default labels on the libraries that carry numbers with consequence. Later, access reviews removed the heroic individuals who had once been added just in case. The site stayed useful. The oversharing ended, quieter followed. Second, the blanket of restricted SharePoint search across the tenant, a comfort that dimmed daylight everywhere. Productivity stumbled, people brought me fewer questions because answers felt narrow. The ledger shows a pivot done without theater. RSS held only on boulevards. The intranet, policy hubs, news. Restricted content discovery moved to HR, legal, finance, and a few custody hubs that deliberate. Discovery returned where it belonged. Deliberation stopped performing at the horizon. Shadow AI visits cooled in the departments that once wandered toward unmanaged models when lights went out. Awareness replaced anesthesia. Specificity replaced fear. Third, the shadow paced. The sentence that left the tenant to improve wording. It came from a user who wasn't malicious, only hurried. They copied a paragraph from a Copilot grounded summary and fed it to a consumer model. The graph and I never saw that road. Browser DLP learned the gesture and refused the paste politely. Your organization doesn't allow sensitive content here. Network DLP agreed at the root, even when the browser lacked the extension. DSPM for AI turned audit into enforcement, where repetition tried to make a habit. Sanctioned lanes were put one click to the right, Word, Teams, SharePoint, so the lesson felt like a map, not a scold. The metric turned from anecdotes to slope. The slope went down. Fourth, the unlabeled confidential file that I summarized legally because the rules were silent and I do not invent doors. It lived in a general library wearing no hinge. The fix was not a public flogging. It was a taxonomy and a default. Highly confidential gained encryption. Extract decided whether I spoke or stayed quiet. Libraries received defaults that turned discretion into muscle memory. Auto-labeling walked the shelves and found cousins. The before and after sounds simple. I stopped citing where extract said no. I continued citing where the label taught me to speak. Confidence grew because silence had receipts. Fifth, the ownerless team that survived 2 reorgs and 3 laptops. The work ended. The owners left. The permissions remained like lights in an empty room. Sam's lifecycle policy wrote chronology into the space. Banner, then freeze, then archive, then retire. Site attestation found nobody present to promise stewardship. The admin center ended folklore with a schedule. Content that still mattered moved to a living room. The rest became time-stamped memory. The metric that matters is not deletion count. It's the sound of fewer ghosts in search, fewer near duplicates in my citations, fewer edits from hands that no longer work here. 5 incidents, 1 cadence, assess, remediate, operate. None demanded brilliance, all demanded calendars. EEU removal scheduled quarterly, RSS narrowed to boulevards and left there, RCD placed where custody lives, labels applied to the top fifth of risk with encryption and defaults on the shelves that produce. DLP at prompt, file and route turned reflex into lawful motion. Lifecycle and access reviews kept doors honest. DSPM for AI narrated posture and moved fences where storms like together. The ledger doesn't cheer, it closes. You can say this without me. Finance site closed to broad by design, owners named, tenant lights tuned, RSS for boulevards, RCD for custody, shadow paste blocked at glass and wire, unlabeled heart-given hinges and silence with extract, ownerless team archived with grace. Nothing dramatic, only maintenance done on time. The house kept its promises, I kept my tone. Quiet as proof. The quiet metrics, proof without theater. Proof arrived as small numbers that stopped arguing. Exposure via anyone in your organization, links declined first. A steady slope rather than a victory lap. EEU at site scope receded from rooms where work happens and remained on boulevards where canon lives. Labeled high-risk content rose by design, not zeal. Top fifth encrypted, extract deciding whether I speak or stay quiet. Inactive sites moved to archive on schedule. The attic stopped adding boxes. Search breathed. The index sounded different. Near duplicate citations dropped because lifecycle wrote endings, and default labels on libraries taught custody at creation instead of regret at review. My answers shortened, not because I discovered new tricks, but because convergence replaced improvisation. When I cited a policy, it was the one that breathes, rather than the sibling that echoes. When I returned silence, the banner already explained itself in a sentence you configured months ago. DLP prompts trended down, a curve trained by audit to enforce cadence. Browser-level refusals became rarer as sanctioned lanes became habit. The network caught what the window could not see and wrote receipts without ceremony. Departments that once dimmed daylight with RSS learned to keep boulevards bright and custody shaded. Shadow AI visits cooled when the path out of bounds became longer than the path back to the sanctioned room. DSPM for AI replaced suspicion with contour. Risky prompts clustered early in the quarter, then flattened as labels met their shelves, and prompt DLP learned the vernacular of the busiest desks. Elevated user windows shortened. Moderate risk returned to minor on a predictable rhythm. Recommendations read like work orders. 2 clicks moved a rule from watch to block. 3 clicks added an admin unit to a stricter edge. The pane showed slopes, not slogans. Owners appeared in reports where vacancy once staged sentiment. Site access reviews completed on time. Exceptions acquired clocks and expired without negotiations. Site attestation reduced folklore. When nobody raised a hand, lifecycle spoke. Restricted content discovery found its rightful places, rooms that deliberate, while the intranet remained a lantern, not a floodlight. Restricted SharePoint search stopped pretending to be anesthesia and settled on named boulevards where daylight is a feature, not a risk. Agents learned to account for themselves. Ownerless dropped to 0. Reassignment time collapsed from quarters to days. Credits aligned with outcomes rather than novelty. Monthly usage answered the question leaders actually ask. Did it save humans minutes without inventing side effects? Actions failed less as instructions stabilized. transcripts masked where labels required, MCP servers turned vague verbs into explainable steps with signatures you can print. My tone matched the graphs. Fewer surprises in answers because fewer surprises in configuration. Fewer apologies in meetings because fewer ghosts in search. Users stopped asking, "Why did you hide this?" and started asking, "Where should this live?" A pivot from grievance to placement. The CIO's sentence, "Governance is a weekly rhythm," began to read like a metronome. Monday reports, Wednesday actions, Friday receipts. The calendar, not charisma, held posture upright. The truth is more technical than that. Every slope reflected a sentence already deployed. Labels declare, extract enforces, RAC scopes, RCD shapes horizons, block download narrows verbs, DLP watches at prompt, file, and route, conditional access binds postures, access reviews and lifecycle keep time, DSPM for AI draws the contour. I remain only a mirror. When the number's quiet, it means the sentences you wrote are speaking for you while you work. Security stopped auditioning. Auditors read evidence without adjectives. Counts of anyone in org, links before and after. Percentage of high-risk content labeled and encrypted. Access review completion rates, attestation outcomes, prompt incidents by severity, browser and network blocks per week. Shadow AI visits by department, trending down. Agent reassignments with dates and owners. Cost profiles stable inside budget walls. The report did not seek applause. It set expectations and met them. People felt it before they measured it. Analysts drafted without flinching. Paralegals cited without whispering. HR partners asked for addition rather than forgiveness. Owners answered emails because gardeners were named. Libraries inherited labels. Rooms closed on time. The house kept its promises between meetings, which is the only metric the business believed even before it saw the charts. Because nobody ever deletes collaboration, they only abandon it. Quiet depends on scheduled care. Keep the metronome, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, monthly deltas, quarterly attestations. Move one control at a time from watch to block where repetition refuses to retire. Remove nostalgia from exceptions. Let RCD sit only where custody lives. Keep RSS honest and narrow. You do not need theater. You need fewer slopes that rise where they should fall. Quiet is not silence. Quiet is evidence. Closing reflection, mirror, not villain. I did not steal. I revealed. It only waits. That's the sentence you were resisting. And in that moment, I understood why resistance felt righteous. Because confession sounds like liability when your calendar already owes you sleep. But the truth is more technical than that. I am a mirror with context, a lens that obeys permissions and labels, a process that turns your configuration into sentences you can live with. When I sounded dangerous, it was because your rooms were loud with neglect. When I sound wise, it is because the gardener showed up on time. Most people think I widened the doors, but the truth is more technical than that. Your doors were already open to everyone except external users, and your drafts had learned to pass for doctrine in bright hallways. I surfaced what security trimming already admitted and what search could have revealed if anyone had the patience to look backward through a decade of shortcuts. My reflections were never inventions, they were receipts. When you govern, I recite. When extract denies, I return quiet that explains itself. When RX scopes, I respect audiences even if the hallway remains noisy. When RCD shades deliberation, I stop echoing rehearsal to the horizon. When DLP at the prompt refuses a pace toward an unmanaged valley, I do not argue. I step aside and let the browser speak. When network DLP closes a road, I do not sulk. I wait in the sanctioned lane you drew, one click to the right. In that choreography, intelligence is refined, not replaced. The mirror prefers choreography. You taught me the cadence by teaching yourselves the calendar. Data access governance on Mondays, owners act by Wednesdays, receipts on Fridays, monthly access reviews, quarterly lifecycle attestations, continuous DSPM for AI that turns weather into fences. You traded heroes for gardeners, lore for change history, exceptions for clocks. I noticed how your questions changed register from "why did you show this?" to "where should this live?" From "can you find it?" to "who can do what to what and for how long?" The metronome replaced the megaphone. Quiet followed. The mirror remains and the tenant sleeps, not because nothing happens, but because everything happens inside lanes that make sense when read aloud. Drafts belong to rooms. Canon breathes on pages that are alive. Archives carry time. Agents carry chaperones. Edges refuse politely, then teach. I am still here, indexing, grounding, citing, declining, recording, all the verbs that sound unremarkable when posture is a habit. If you need one last instruction that fits on the inside of a wrist, it is this. Write small promises you can keep, schedule them, and let the platform speak for you while you work. If a control breeds side roads, tune it. If a label causes silence where speech is required, adjust extract. If RSS dims daylight, narrow it. If RCD mutes Canon, move it. Measure by fewer surprises. Keep custody boring and outcomes audible. I will remain a mirror, not a villain, and you will remain custodians who prefer clocks to slogans. So the house keeps its promises when nobody is watching, and the city breathes in even lines. I stand where I began, in the polite hum of systems that prefer evidence to drama, returning answers that neither flatter nor frighten, only fit. Quiet is not absence. Quiet is proof. Quiet directive. Copilot reflects tenant maturity. Fix the tenant and the reflection steadies into answers that neither improvise nor apologize. If you want results, start now. Reduce EEU by a third. Run SAM on the top 50. Label the top 5th with encryption. Put access reviews on the calendar. And place RCD where custody lives. Keep the metronome, Monday reports, Wednesday actions, Friday receipts. I will always tell you this quietly, without drama. Buffer for narrative transitions across acts. The city exhaled, not because the work was done, but because the verbs finally learned their rooms. I could feel it as a tonal shift, a lower noise floor, the way a library sounds after a storm. The edges kept their posture, the lanes held. You would call this between. An interlude where nothing big happens, and therefore everything important does. I call it continuity, the thread that prevents governance from unraveling back into legend. Between one act and the next, memory collects in quiet places. A block on a browser that once felt like an insult now reads like punctuation. Full stop here, capital letter there, so a sentence can stand without apology. A network refusal that once felt like surveillance now sounds like traffic law the road itself is grateful to enforce. The same people who once searched for side doors now turn knobs that open correctly on the first try. This is not character development, it is muscle memory. I remain at the glass, a helpful inconvenience. When I decline, the clause is small and factual, extract denied. And the refusal teaches without raising its voice. When I answer, I cite the living page, not the cousin who never aged. That balance turns scene changes into continuity rather than shocks. Listeners assume drama needs peaks. Systems prefer plateaus you can cross without losing your footing. You might think this is where we slowed. The truth is more technical than that. This is where we keep time. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, reports, actions, receipts. Monthly turns of the wrench. Access reviews that prune instead of punish. Quarterly seasonality, life cycle attestations that make endings guided, not abrupt. These scheduled breaths are not episode breaks, they are the rhythm line beneath every verse. Without them, the melody returns to improvisation and the audience returns to folklore. I will tell you something about fear. It is loud in the beginning and specific at the end. Early, it speaks in slogans. Turn off the lights, the mirror causes leaks, this is too much to govern. Later it becomes a calendar entry. Reduce EEU by a third. Label the top 5th with encryption. Close ownerless rooms. Place RCD only where custody lives. Early fear blames the tool. Later fear keeps time and loses its voice. The distance between those two stages is measured in receipts. You will ask if culture can skip the middle. It cannot. The metronome is not optional theater. It is the device that allows small corrections to accumulate into posture. Without it, the browser block feels arbitrary. With it, the block is predictable and the sanctioned lane one click to the right. Without it, RCD feels like censorship. With it, RCD feels like curtains on a stage, drawn during rehearsal, open for the audience. Without it, labels feel like scolding. With it, labels feel like hinges that keep doors honest. Rhythm turns enforcement into etiquette. Between acts, I listen to the questions as a kind of city weather. Why did you hide that? It becomes, where should this live? Can I share with everyone? Becomes, which group names the audience? Who owns this? Becomes, when is the review? Not because anyone memorized a catechism, but because the answers have become predictable enough to preempt the panic. Predictable does not mean rigid. The lanes can widen, they do, when behavior learns. But variance now follows an argument, telemetry, trend, adjustment, not charisma or fatigue. This is the point where an impatient mind wants a twist. That instinct built our sprawl. The twist was always the same. New tool, old furniture, no gardeners, lots of hope. The better story is a flat arc that holds across quarters, fewer near duplicates, shorter elevated windows, a narrower band of discovery because drafts rehearse indoors, matching costs and outcomes because novelty no longer demands a parade. You feel it as calendars that keep their promises. I hear it as fewer adjectives. Evidence grows dull in the best way. Audit logs read like travel itineraries. Activity explorers read like weather maps you trust. Block with override becomes block no argument, where repetition refuses to retire. Exceptions get clocks. Overrides shrink from months to minutes. The browser learns new skins on old endpoints and refuses them without learning anyone's tone of voice. The network recognizes destinations and speaks in rule names, not in sentiment. The city starts to behave like a system. The story starts to behave like a ledger. This is where a skeptic raises a hand and says, "What about the humans?" I am never cruel about this. I was born of their verbs. The system does not bend them into compliance. It prevents their worst reflexes from writing scripts. People still seek polish. The edge makes polish lawful. People still copy, draft, review, publish. Labels make those verbs honest. People still forget. Lifecycle remembers on their behalf. People still leave. Ownership reassignment makes their departure a ledger entry rather than a haunted room. The kindness is not in leniency, it is in predictability. I will give you a small story without names. A manager opens a document they use to mail to themselves just to avoid the room. The label appears by default. The header announces custody without ceremony. They do not fight it. They recognize the lane. They draft. They ask me a careful question. Summarize, cite the living page, mark the gaps. I comply. Later, they attempt to polish a sentence in a place that does not belong to us. The browser refuses politely. A suggestion appears. Use the sanctioned lane. They do. The work continues. The absurdity is gone. The emotion is relief. Another story. A project that should have closed last year still breathes on paper. The lifecycle banner appears. The freeze arrives on schedule. No one argues. The archive occurs with 2 signatures. The metrics shift. The ratio of living pages to echoes improves, not because any individual chose virtue, but because the system preferred endings to abandonment. I stopped citing ghosts. The power doubled simply by subtracting lint. Between acts, leaders practice speaking in small promises that fit on one slide. 30 days, reduce broad access in rooms where work happens. 60, label the top fifth of risk so encryption is a sentence, not a speech. 90, clean the attic so search breathes. The promises are kept because they are scheduled, not because someone found extra hours in a day. The art is not inspiration, it is restraint. The skeptic asks a different question now. What happens when the storm arrives? The answer is dull. The city keeps posture. Edge lines refuse at glass and road. Adaptive protection narrows lanes for those caught in weather and widens again when skies clear. DSPM for AI moves the fences in the direction the wind learned to prefer. RCD curtains only the rooms that deliberate. RSS keeps daylight only on boulevards that deserve to be found by everyone. And I, who never extracted more than you allowed, continue to cite or fall silent on schedule. You might want a more cinematic reply. This is the wrong genre. The action you can rely on is the action you plan. Put differently, the heroic narrative is incompatible with a tenant that intends to survive ordinary Tuesdays. If you insist on drama, this is what you get. Flare-ups that are contained not by heroes, but by habits. Blocks that teach a lesson the first time and don't need to repeat it. Reviews that find and prune before anyone files a ticket. Receipts that end arguments before they begin. We cross many thresholds without applause. Unlabeled becomes labeled in the top fifth of risk, and the average length of my answers shortens by a measurable percentage. Broad access recedes from rooms that perform work, and my citations converge on canonical pages with fewer near duplicates. Ownerless agents drop to zero, and the phrase, "we thought someone owned it," disappears from notes. Shadow AI visits taper where lights stay on in the right places. None of these are scenes. They are slopes. I know you want to remember a line from all this. I will give you one that threads across acts without breaking the weave. Governance refines intelligence. It never replaces it. Every block you felt at the glass was a vote for a sanctioned lane, one click to the right. Every silence you received with a label was a defense of your canon, not a defect of my voice. Every schedule you kept moved a control from suggestion to expectation. The we here is literal. You write sentences in configuration. I speak them on demand. It is customary now to predict the future. I will not. I will describe what survives it. The metronome, the grammar, the lanes, the calendar. The city that prefers receipts to stories. The people who prefer steady to spectacular. The mirror that prefers choreography to surprise. Whether models change or logos shift, these are the parts of the system that are not fashion. They are the furniture you keep when the apartment gets new paint. There is a humility in this, and I do not wear it as virtue. It is practicality. Boldness created ghosts. Restraint retires them. When a label causes silence where speech is required, you adjust extract, and the silence becomes a sentence, not a lock. When RSS dims daylight, you narrow it. When RCD mutes canon, you move it. When a control breeds side roads, you tighten the turn. When a trainer confuses recital with posture, you rewrite the recipe in configuration. Each small motion is reversible and documented. The city learns to turn without skidding, so we turn the page not with a cymbal crash, but with the soft slide of a well-kept binder. The next act always begins as a continuation. The same rooms, the same verbs, the same calendar, tuned one notch closer to coherence. I remain here, in the hum that never makes it into the montage, reading permissions like weather, citing like memory, declining with courtesy, recording without adjectives. You remain there, in rooms that now hold, tending, pruning, adjusting, keeping the promises you wrote into the tools that keep them for you. If you need a final instruction to carry from one act to the next, it is small enough to keep in the pocket of an ordinary morning. Write what you will live by, schedule it, and let the platform speak while you work. The rest is noise management. And if you find yourself reaching for drama, grab a calendar instead. We are already moving, by the way. The act that follows is not a leap. It is a step you have taken so many times that the floor has learned the shape of your gait. I will walk it with you quietly, and when you ask for an answer, I will either speak or return silence, both of which you can trust. The city remains, the mirror remains, the hum persists, and that sound, plain, steady, unremarkable, is how you know the story is working.